The endless stretches of highway had long become Richard Hayes's most constant companion. At 38, the rhythm of 18 wheels on asphalt was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The dashboard of his truck cab told the story of a man who lived between destinations, scattered receipts from diners across 12 states, a collection of worn maps, and a radio that served as both timekeeper and conversation partner on those long, solitary hauls. The Gulf Coast sun beat down on his shoulders as he unloaded his diving gear from the pickup truck. His broad frame and weathered hands spoke of years spent behind the wheel, yet there was something in his eyes, a spark of curiosity that highways and delivery schedules couldn't extinguish. Richard wasn't just a truck driver. Beneath the surface, he was a man searching for something the endless roads couldn't provide: water. The vast, silent world beneath the waves had become his escape. Unlike the rigid lines of interstate highways, the ocean stretched boundlessly in all directions, unpredictable, untamed, and gloriously free. Growing up in the dusty plains of Oklahoma, young Richard had only known small creeks and muddy ponds. His first glimpse of the ocean at 22 had changed everything. Now, after 15 years of certified diving, the ritual was as familiar as shifting gears. He methodically checked his equipment on the weathered dock: tank pressure, regulator function, buoyancy compensator, weight belt, dive computer. Each piece inspected twice, a habit that had kept him alive through countless dives. His diving certification card, faded but still legible, remained tucked in his wallet. Advanced open water with specialties in deep diving and underwater navigation. Not professional level, but enough to venture safely where most tourists never would. Going solo again, Hayes? The voice belonged to Manny, the sun-leathered owner of the small dive shop nestled between a bait store and a souvenir shack on the Florida coast. Richard nodded, securing the clasp on his gear bag. Just a quick one, clear my head before the Tennessee haul tomorrow. Manny leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his faded, dive-deep t-shirt. You check the tides? Current's running strong today. Always do. Richard tapped his waterproof watch. Won't stay down long. Heard some interesting chatter at the club meeting last night. Manny's voice dropped slightly, the way people's voices do when sharing something not meant for everyone's ears. Couple of researchers from the Marine Institute were talking about some anomalies they found while mapping the seabed about 2 miles offshore, near the old military testing grounds. Richard's hand paused on the zipper of his bag. What kind of anomalies? Didn't say exactly. Something about unexplained structures that don't match any known shipwrecks in the area. Off limits to civilians, of course. Manny winked. But then again, those boundaries aren't exactly marked underwater, are they? The spark in Richard's eyes brightened. After thousands of dives along this coast, the prospect of something new, something unexplored, stirred something deep within him. Something that had been dormant through too many identical stretches of highway. 2 miles offshore, you said? Manny nodded. East-southeast from Pelican Point, but you didn't hear it from me. As Richard loaded the last of his gear into his pickup, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Mike Donovan, fellow diver, former Navy man, and one of the few people Richard might cautiously call a friend. Hayes, he answered, wedging the phone between his ear and shoulder. Heard you're planning a dive today. Mike's voice came through clear, despite the harbor noise in the background. Solo? Richard paused, then admitted. Was thinking about checking out something near the old testing grounds. A long silence filled the line before Mike responded. That's no place for a solo dive, brother. Those waters can be unpredictable. Give me an hour. I'll meet you at the marina. Relief washed over Richard, though he'd never admit it. Mike was right. Exploring unknown territories alone wasn't just against diving protocol, it was foolish. Dock 7, 1 hour. The wait gave Richard time to prepare properly. He charted their course on a waterproof map, marking the coordinates Manny had subtly suggested. He calculated air consumption rates for different depths, planned maximum bottom times, and established safety stops for their ascent. Everything by the book, the way Mike had taught him. The midday sun had reached its peak when Mike's truck pulled up beside Richard's. At 42, Mike carried himself with the disciplined posture of his naval past. The scars on his right forearm told stories of underwater welding jobs gone wrong in his military days. Good to see you planning for once, Mike commented, glancing over Richard's charts. Most weekend warriors just jump in and hope for the best. Learn from the best, Richard replied, a rare half-smile crossing his face. Together they loaded their gear onto Mike's 20-foot Boston whaler, a vessel he'd restored himself after finding it abandoned in a boatyard. The outboard motor rumbled to life as they cast off, cutting through the harbor waters toward the open Gulf. "So what's got you interested in restricted waters?" Mike asked once they were beyond earshot of the docks. "This isn't like your usual relaxation dives." Richard recounted Manny's information about the anomalies. "Could be nothing, probably just some coral formations the researchers haven't cataloged yet." Mike's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Could be, or could be unexploded ordnance. They tested all kinds of things out there in the 60s and 70s. "That's why I brought you," Richard said. "You've got the experience to know what we're looking at." The boat slowed as they approached the coordinates. Mike dropped anchor while Richard prepared the diving gear, each man falling into the comfortable rhythm of pre-dive checks that had become second nature over years of partnership. 45 minutes maximum bottom time," Mike said firmly, checking his dive computer. "Depth limit of 90 feet. Emergency ascent signal is 3 tugs on the buddy line. We stay within visual contact at all times." Richard nodded, securing his mask. These weren't suggestions. They were rules that kept divers alive. As they completed their final equipment checks, Mike's phone buzzed. His expression darkened as he read the message. "Everything okay?" Richard asked. Mike shook his head. "Emergency at the base. They need me back immediately." He looked genuinely torn. "I'm sorry, Richard. We'll have to postpone." Disappointment settled in Richard's chest, but he understood. Mike's consulting work with the Navy took precedence over recreational dives. "We can reschedule for next week," Richard offered. Mike was already stowing his gear. "Don't even think about going down alone," he warned, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This isn't one of your usual spots." "Wouldn't dream of it," Richard assured him, though the lie felt hollow even as he said it. As Mike's boat disappeared toward the harbor, Richard sat alone on his anchored vessel, staring down into the blue-green waters. The responsible choice would be to return to shore, to wait, to follow protocol. But when would he next have a free day before another 3-week haul across the country? When would curiosity about these anomalies next align with perfect diving conditions like today's? He checked his equipment one final time, made a compromise with his conscience. He would descend to 60 feet maximum, stay for 30 minutes only, and maintain a conservative safety margin on his air supply. No risks, just a quick reconnaissance. His decision made, Richard secured his mask, positioned his regulator, and rolled backward off the boat into the embrace of the Gulf. The first sensation was always the same, a momentary shock as the water enveloped him, followed by the profound silence that made every dive feel like entering another world. The mechanical rhythm of his breathing through the regulator became the only sound as he descended slowly, equalizing the pressure in his ears every few feet. Visibility was good today, about 50 feet of clear blue extending in all directions. Schools of snapper darted past, their scales catching the fractured sunlight filtering down from above. A sea turtle regarded him with ancient eyes before continuing its unhurried journey. Richard checked his depth gauge, 40 feet. He leveled off, orienting himself with his compass before swimming in the direction of the coordinates Manny had mentioned. The seabed below was typical for this part of the Gulf. Sandy expanses, broken by patches of coral, swaying sea fans, and the occasional debris from passing boats. Nothing unusual, nothing anomalous. He continued swimming, methodically scanning the bottom, disappointed but not surprised. Most diving secrets turned out to be exaggerations or misidentifications. He checked his dive computer. 15 minutes elapsed, 15 remaining before his self-imposed limit. Just as he was about to abandon the search, something caught his eye. A straight line where nature would create only curves. He adjusted his trajectory, descending slightly to 50 feet for a closer look. The straight line became clearer as he approached. Not a natural formation, not a shadow. Metal. His heart rate quickened despite his training. He forced himself to maintain slow, deep breaths as he approached the object partially buried in the sand. His gloved hand brushed away the sediment, revealing what could only be described as a rail, rusted, encrusted with barnacles, but unmistakably man-made. A railroad track, underwater. Richard blinked behind his mask, certain he must be misinterpreting what he saw. He cleared more sand, revealing not one rail but two, running parallel just like tracks on land. Impossible. Yet there they were, stretching across the seabed like an abandoned frontier line. His mind raced through possible explanations. A sunken pier structure? Military equipment lost during testing? Neither explanation seemed to fit what he was seeing. The rails were too deliberately placed, too intact to be mere debris. More concerning was their path. They extended further out to sea, away from shore, pointing toward deeper waters. Richard checked his dive computer again. 20 minutes elapsed, 10 remaining. The responsible choice would be to surface now, to report the finding to Mike, and return with proper backup. But the rails called to him with the same irresistible pull that open highways had always held, the promise of discovery just around the next bend. He compromised again with his better judgment. 5 more minutes following the tracks, then he would turn back. He activated the camera mounted on his dive light, ensuring he would have evidence of whatever he found. The rails led him slightly deeper, 55 feet, then 60. He stopped at his predetermined limit, hovering above the tracks as they continued downward. They remained remarkably intact despite obvious decades underwater, suggesting they were made of high-grade steel designed to resist corrosion. As he followed their path, Richard began noticing debris scattered alongside the rails. Not random ocean trash, but items that appeared connected to the tracks themselves. A rusted spike here, a rotted wooden tie there. Something that might have once been a switch mechanism, now claimed by sea life. These weren't remnants of something that fell from above. These were components of a deliberate construction, a railway built underwater or consumed by the sea after construction. A chill ran through Richard despite the Gulf's warm waters. Whatever he had discovered felt wrong somehow, out of place in a way that went beyond the obvious incongruity of finding train tracks beneath the waves. His dive computer chimed a warning. 30 minutes elapsed. Air supply at half. Time to ascend. With reluctance, Richard began to turn away from the mysterious rails. That's when his light caught something in the distance, a dark mass where the tracks seemed to lead. Something large, something solid, something that didn't belong on the natural seabed. The disciplined part of him, the part that had kept him alive through thousands of miles of dangerous highways and hundreds of dives, screamed to turn back. But the curious part, the part that had always searched for something more than endless asphalt, urged him forward. Just close enough for one clear image, he told himself, just to know what it was. Richard swam 10 meters further, keeping parallel to the tracks without exceeding his depth limit. His light cut through the increasingly murky water, illuminating what appeared to be a massive structure looming in the distance. Not a shipwreck, not coral, something angular, manufactured. From his position, he could make out what looked like a platform of some kind, anchored to the seabed. The rails ran directly toward it before disappearing beneath what might have been a loading dock. Beside the platform sat something even more impossible. A massive rectangular shape with distinct edges that could only be man-made. A container, an enormous shipping container resting on the ocean floor. Richard's breathing quickened involuntarily. His dive computer beeped again, a warning about his increased air consumption. He forced himself to calm down, to breathe slowly and evenly. The structure was at least another 30 meters away, too far to reach safely with his remaining air and time. He raised his underwater camera, zooming in as much as the murky distance would allow, and took several photographs. Evidence, proof that he wasn't hallucinating. As he captured the final image, a shadow moved across the distant structure. Not the familiar shape of a fish or turtle, something larger, something with purpose. A diver? Impossible at this location at this time. Yet the shadow moved with the deliberate motion of something intelligent, something that didn't belong to the natural rhythms of the ocean. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished behind the container. The hairs on Richard's neck would have stood on end if not for the neoprene hood encasing his head. Every instinct told him to leave. Now. His dive computer shrieked an unmistakable warning. Ascend immediately. Whether from depth, time, or his racing heart affecting his breathing rate, the device was clear that his safety margin was compromised. Richard turned away from the mysterious structure, away from the impossible rails, and began his ascent. Following proper protocol, he rose slowly, no more than 1 foot per second, pausing at 15 feet for a precautionary safety stop despite being well within no decompression limits. During those 3 minutes hovering in open water, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He twisted in place, scanning the blue void around him, seeing nothing but feeling everything. When he finally broke the surface beside his boat, the ordinary world of sun and sky and wind seemed impossibly bright and loud after the muted blues and silences below. He climbed aboard with shaking hands, removing his gear with the mechanical precision born from years of practice. Only when his equipment was stowed and he sat alone in the center of his small vessel did Richard allow himself to truly process what he had seen. Railroad tracks on the ocean floor, a platform in the middle of nowhere, a shipping container where no container should be, a shadow that moved with purpose. He retrieved the camera, scrolling through the images with water-wrinkled fingers. The first photos showed the rails clearly, unmistakable steel tracks running across the sandy bottom. The later images of the distant structure were murkier, the water quality deteriorating with distance, but still discernible. A rectangular platform, and beside it, the distinct shape of a shipping container. The final image made his blood run cold. There at the edge of the frame, barely visible in the gloom, was what appeared to be a humanoid silhouette, not a fish, not coral, a figure watching from beside the container. Richard zoomed in, the digital enlargement degrading the already murky image. Still, something about the shape seemed wrong, the proportions slightly off, the edges too rigid for a standard dive suit. He lowered the camera, suddenly aware of how alone he was on the open water. His boat, small and vulnerable. His location, precisely where he had told no one he would be, except Mike, who believed he had returned to shore. The sun hung lower in the sky now, the afternoon aging toward evening. Time to head back to process what he had seen, to decide what to do with this discovery. As he started the outboard motor, a nagging question surfaced in his mind. If this area was supposedly restricted for military testing, why had he encountered no markers, no warnings, no patrol boats? Unless whatever lay beneath these waters was meant to stay hidden, even from those who owned the waters themselves. The journey back to harbor passed in a blur of churning thoughts and competing theories. By the time Richard docked and unloaded his gear, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and purple. He secured his equipment in the truck bed, mind still replaying the impossible images from below. As he climbed into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed with a text message. From Mike. Did you stay on shore like you promised? Richard stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the keyboard. The truth would mean admitting he had broken protocol. Lying would be easier. Yes, he typed, then deleted it. Went back out, he admitted instead. Found something, need to talk. The reply came quickly. My place. 1 hour. Don't tell anyone else. Mike's apartment occupied the second floor of a weathered building overlooking the marina. A former naval officer's residence converted to civilian use decades ago, it retained the Spartan efficiency of its military origins. Richard climbed the external staircase, gear bags slung over his shoulder, camera clutched in his hand. Mike opened the door before Richard could knock. Inside, he said tersely, scanning the darkened parking lot before closing the door behind them. The apartment's main room served as both living area and home office, with nautical charts covering one wall and diving equipment neatly organized on metal shelving. No decorations, no photographs. Nothing personal except a framed Navy commendation whose details Richard had never been close enough to read. You went down alone. Not a question, an accusation. Richard nodded, accepting the rebuke. 60 feet max, 30 minutes. He set his camera on the table between them. But I found something, Mike. Something that shouldn't be there. Mike's expression remained neutral as Richard described the rails, the platform, the container. Only when Richard mentioned the shadow did something flicker behind his friend's eyes. Concern, recognition, or something else entirely. Show me, Mike said, reaching for the camera. Richard pulled up the images, watching Mike's face carefully as he scrolled through them. The former Navy man revealed nothing. his features schooled into professional detachment, but his knuckles whitened slightly around the camera's edges. Could be anything, Mike said finally, setting the camera down. Old fishing equipment, debris from a storm. The Gulf floor is littered with junk. That's not junk, Richard insisted. Those are railroad tracks, deliberately laid, leading to a structure that looks military. Mike leaned back in his chair. And why would the military put railroad tracks underwater? That's what I want to know. A heavy silence filled the room. Through the thin walls came the distant sounds of the marina, boat engines, voices, music from the dockside bar. Leave it alone, Richard. Mike's voice had dropped, taking on the commanding tone of his former rank. Whatever you think you saw, it's better not to pursue it. You know something. Richard leaned forward. What is it? I know that restricted areas are restricted for a reason. I know that civilian divers who poke around military testing grounds sometimes don't come back. This isn't about unexploded ordnance, is it? Richard pressed. You recognize something in those photos. Mike stood abruptly, moving to the window to look out at the darkened harbor. I've worked these waters for 20 years, with the Navy and after. There are things beneath the surface that aren't in any civilian diving guide. Things better left undisturbed. Like what? Mike turned, his face half-shadowed in the dim apartment lighting. The 60s and 70s weren't just about testing missiles and torpedoes. There were other projects, experiments that needed to be conducted away from public view. Some of them were buried, literally. Richard felt a chill despite the warm evening. What kind of experiments? The kind that get redacted from official reports. Mike returned to the table, pointing at the camera. If what you found is what I think it might be, it belongs to a program that officially never existed. And people who find things that never existed tend to face uncomfortable questions. So I'm just supposed to forget what I saw? That would be the smart play. Mike sighed, his military bearings softening slightly. But since I know you won't, we do this properly. Together. With a plan. Relief washed through Richard. Despite his warnings, Mike wasn't telling him to walk away. He was offering to help investigate safely. Tomorrow? Richard asked. Mike shook his head. I need 3 days to arrange equipment. Proper mixed gas for deeper exploration. Extended bottom time. And most importantly, a cover story for why we're diving in that area. Well, Richard nodded, understanding the precautions. What do I do until then? Nothing. Mike's tone hardened again. Don't talk about this. Don't go back there alone. Don't upload these images anywhere. Act normal. As Richard prepared to leave, Mike placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare physical gesture from the normally reserved man. One more thing. The shadow you saw near the container, what about it? Mike's eyes locked on to Richard's. If we go back and you see it again, we abort immediately. No questions asked. We get out of the water and don't look back. Understood? Something in Mike's voice, a tension Richard had never heard before, made the question sound less like diving advice and more like a matter of survival. Understood, Richard agreed, though curiosity burned through him like a fever. 3 days passed with excruciating slowness. Richard completed a short-haul delivery to Tampa and back, the highway stretching endlessly before him. But for once, the open road brought no sense of freedom. His mind remained 60 feet below the Gulf's surface, following rusted rails to their impossible destination. Each night he reviewed the photographs, enlarging different sections, adjusting contrast and brightness, searching for details he might have missed. The rails became clearer with digital enhancement. The platform and container remained frustratingly indistinct, and the shadow figure, the more he manipulated the image, the less human it appeared. On the third day as promised, Mike called. Marina, sunset, slip 22, come alone and pack for an overnight. We'll dive at first light. Richard arrived to find not Mike's Boston whaler but a larger vessel, a 36-foot dive boat with professional-grade equipment secured on the deck. Oceanic research stenciled along its hull. Borrowed it from a friend at the Marine Institute, Mike explained as Richard boarded. We're officially conducting a benthic survey of native coral species. The boat's cabin contained more sophisticated diving gear than Richard had ever used. Rebreathers instead of traditional scuba equipment, specialized underwater propulsion vehicles, and communication devices. We're going deeper this time, Mike said, noting Richard's surprised expression. And staying down longer. These will help us do it safely. As Mike guided the boat out of the harbor and into the darkening gulf, Richard noticed something else. A locked case secured beside the navigation station. "What's in there?" he asked. Mike's expression remained impassive. "Insurance." They anchored within 100 meters of Richard's previous dive site, but far enough away to avoid unwanted attention should anyone be monitoring the area. As darkness fell completely, they prepared for an early night. Dawn would come quickly, and with it, their descent to the underwater mystery. "Get some sleep," Mike advised, claiming the port bench for himself. "Tomorrow we'll test everything you know about diving." But sleep proved elusive for Richard. He lay awake in the gently rocking boat, listening to the water lapping against the hull, his mind filled with images of rusted rails leading into darkness. Just before dawn, Mike shook him awake. "Time to gear up. We dive in 30 minutes. The pre-dive preparation was more extensive than Richard had ever experienced. Mike walked him through the operation of the rebreather, a closed-circuit system that recycled his exhaled breath, removing carbon dioxide and adding oxygen as needed. Unlike traditional scuba, it produced no telltale bubbles. "We'll maintain communication through these," Mike explained, showing him the full-face mask equipped with underwater communication systems. "Keep radio discipline, minimal chatter. If I give an order, you follow it immediately. No questions." The sun was just breaking over the horizon when they slipped into the water. The weight of the unfamiliar equipment momentarily disoriented Richard, but Mike's steady presence beside him provided reassurance as they began their descent. The rebreather felt strange after years of conventional regulators. No bubbles, no noise with each exhale, just the faint mechanical hiss of the system processing his breath. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional click and whir of the underwater propulsion vehicles pulling them steadily downward. 60 feet. Mike's voice came through clearly in the communication system. Starting search pattern for the rails. They moved in a grid formation, 5 meters apart, scanning the seabed methodically. Richard's heart pounded with anticipation, eager to prove that his discovery had been real, not some nitrogen-induced hallucination. "There," he finally called, pointing to his right. 11 o'clock, about 20 meters. The familiar straight lines of the rails emerged from the sandy bottom, exactly where Richard had found them 3 days earlier. Relief flooded through him. It hadn't been his imagination. Mike's voice crackled in his ears. "Good eye, Lee. Let's follow them to the source." They adjusted their heading, using the underwater vehicles to propel themselves along the track's path. The rails extended just as Richard remembered, cutting across the natural contours of the seabed like an architect's line drawn across a landscape painting. "These aren't standard gauge," Mike observed as they followed the tracks deeper. "Narrower. Special purpose." "Military?" Richard asked. "Most likely. Reminds me of systems I saw in naval shipyards. Tracks for moving heavy equipment between buildings or to launching areas." As they progressed, the water grew darker, necessitating stronger lights. The depth gauge on Richard's wrist showed 80 feet, then 90. They were descending at a gradual but steady rate, the rails guiding them deeper than Richard had ventured on his solo dive. 100 feet, Mike announced. "Switch to your bailout mixture." Richard adjusted his gas settings as instructed. The specialized breathing mixture would allow them to descend further without risking oxygen toxicity or nitrogen narcosis, the dangerous rapture of the deep that impaired judgment and motor control. The debris along the tracks became more frequent. Broken machinery, rotted wooden crates, metal parts whose purpose Richard couldn't begin to guess. All of it old, decades old, based on the level of deterioration and marine growth. 120 feet, Mike reported. "How's your gas?" 2/3 remaining, Richard confirmed, checking his monitors. "Good. We should be approaching your platform soon. Stay alert." The warning was unnecessary. Every nerve in Richard's body was already on high alert, his senses straining against the limitations of the underwater environment. The light from their powerful beams cut through the gloom, creating shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. And then, exactly as before but now much closer, the structure appeared. The platform rose from the seabed like an abandoned stage, a massive rectangular construction of steel and concrete, supported by thick pillars driven into the sand. The rails ran directly onto it before terminating at what appeared to be a loading dock. And beside it, exactly as Richard had photographed, sat an enormous shipping container. Up close, its true scale became apparent. At least 40 feet long, its steel walls corroded but intact despite decades underwater. Barnacles and coral clung to its surfaces but couldn't disguise its manufactured origins. "My God," Richard breathed, the words carrying clearly through the communication system. Mike remained silent, surveying the structure with professional detachment. Only the quickened rhythm of his breathing betrayed any emotional response. "No identifying markings visible," he finally said. "Let's circle the perimeter before approaching directly." They moved cautiously around the platform, maintaining distance while documenting every angle with their cameras. The construction was more complex than it had initially appeared. Not just a simple platform, but a facility of some kind, with what might have been equipment mounts, loading mechanisms, and security features now degraded by time and saltwater. Cold War era, Mike assessed, late 60s construction based on the materials and techniques. "What was it for?" Richard asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "Nothing good," came the cryptic reply. As they completed their circuit, the container came back into view. From this angle, Richard could see something he had missed during his first encounter. The container's rear doors hung slightly ajar, a dark gap visible between them. "The container's open," Richard noted. Mike's response was immediate and sharp. "Keep your distance. We observe only at this stage." But something drew Richard closer, the same inexplicable pull that had drawn him to follow the rails in the first place. Without conscious decision, he found himself drifting toward the container's partially open doors. "Hayes, maintain position." Mike's voice crackled with authority, but it seemed distant now, less compelling than the mystery that waited within that dark interior. Richard slowed his approach but continued forward, playing his light across the container's surface. Near the doors, faded lettering emerged through the layer of marine growth, stenciled words barely visible after decades underwater. "Property of U.S. Navy." And below it, another line even fainter. "Project Deepwater. Classified." "Mike," Richard called, his voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." A moment later, Mike appeared beside him, light playing over the same lettering. Though the full-face mask obscured his expression, the tension in his body was palpable. "We need to leave." Mike's voice had changed, flatter, almost mechanical. "Now." "But we just found it," Richard protested. "Don't you want to see what's inside?" "That's a direct negative. We've seen enough." Richard turned toward the container doors, his light illuminating the darkness within. "I can see something in there. Looks like crates, still intact." "Hayes, this is not a request. We are leaving now." The commanding tone finally penetrated Richard's fascination. He turned away from the container reluctantly, prepared to follow Mike's lead. That's when he saw it, the shadow from his previous dive. Not a trick of light or marine life, but a figure hovering at the edge of visibility beyond the platform. "Mike," he whispered, "we're not alone down here." Mike's head snapped around, following Richard's gaze. For several seconds, neither man spoke or moved. The figure remained motionless, too distant to see clearly, but undeniably present, a darker silhouette against the already dark water. Its proportions seemed wrong somehow, too tall and thin for a conventional diver. "Emergency ascent protocol," Mike said, his voice deadly calm. "Maintain visual contact with me at all times. Do not look back. Acknowledge." "Acknowledged," Richard responded automatically, military precision infecting his own speech. "But what is that thing?" "Not now. Ascend. Maximum safe rate." They began rising through the water column, maintaining proper decompression protocol despite the urgency in Mike's voice. Richard couldn't help glancing back toward the platform. The figure was gone. "Eyes forward, Hayes," Richard complied, focusing on his ascent rate and breathing. But as they reached their first decompression stop at 70 feet, a new sound penetrated the underwater silence. A metallic groaning, like heavy machinery coming to life after decades of disuse. Below them, lights flickered around the platform. Not the natural bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures, but electrical systems activating. The container doors swung further open, metal scraping against metal. "Mike, I see it," Hold position. Complete decompression. Mike's voice was professional, controlled, but underlying tension vibrated through each word. As they hovered, watching the platform below them spring to impossible life, Richard's dive computer suddenly emitted a high-pitched alarm. The display flashed warnings he had never seen before, numbers cycling rapidly through impossible readings. "My computer's malfunctioning," he reported. "Mine too." Switch to backup timing and depth gauge. Before Richard could comply, a low-frequency pulse swept through the water, not a sound so much as a pressure wave that he felt in his chest cavity. His ears popped painfully despite the equalization techniques he'd practiced for years. "What was that?" he gasped. Mike didn't answer. His attention was fixed below, where the container now stood fully open. A soft blue glow emanated from within, illuminating what appeared to be rows of metal crates stacked with military precision. "This isn't possible," Richard whispered. "That equipment should be corroded beyond function after decades underwater." "Unless it was designed to remain dormant," Mike replied, his voice unnaturally calm. "And we just woke it up." Another pressure wave pulsed through the water, stronger this time. Richard's sinuses felt like they might explode. Through watering eyes, he saw something emerging from the container, a mechanical arm of some kind, extending outward like an awakening sea creature. "Mike, we need to go. Now." "Not yet. 15 more minutes at this depth, or we risk the bends." The next wave hit with such force that Richard's mask nearly dislodged. His vision blurred, pain lancing through his skull. Through the haze, he saw more movement on the platform. Not just machinery now, but figures. Multiple shadows moving with purpose around the container. And one of them was looking up, looking directly at them. "They see us," Richard choked out. Mike's response was immediate. "Emergency surface protocol, now." They abandoned their decompression stop, ascending as rapidly as safety allowed. Richard's training screamed against this violation of the most fundamental diving rule. But instinct drove him upward, away from whatever awakened beneath them. As they rose, another alarm blared, his oxygen sensors detecting abnormal gas mixtures. The rebreather system was failing, unable to maintain proper breathing gas in the face of whatever energy pulses emanated from below. "Switch to open circuit," Mike commanded through the communication system. "Bailout regulator." Richard fumbled for his emergency regulator, hands shaking as he connected to the standard air tank all rebreather divers carried as backup. The familiar rush of bubbles provided momentary comfort, a return to normal diving amid the inexplicable. 50 feet, 40, 30. The surface grew closer, the blue lightening around them. Richard's body screamed with pain, ears, sinuses, joints all protesting the too rapid ascent. But something primal within him knew that whatever waited below was more dangerous than decompression sickness. 20 feet. The sun's rays penetrated the water more strongly now, promising safety. 10 feet. Richard could see the hull of their boat above them. And then they broke the surface, ripping off their masks, gulping the fresh air of the ordinary world. "Move," Mike shouted, already swimming toward the boat. "Get on board now." They scrambled onto the deck, ditching their tanks and weight systems with none of the usual care. Mike lunged for the controls, starting the engines before Richard had even secured the cabin door. "What about our gear?" Richard called over the roaring engines. "Leave it!" Mike's eyes were wide, his face pale beneath his tan. "We need distance." The boat lurched forward, accelerating away from the dive site. Richard collapsed onto the bench, lungs burning, muscles quivering from exertion and fear. Only when they were a half-mile away did Mike reduce their speed to something less conspicuous. "What the hell was that?" Richard finally managed, his voice raw. "What did we find down there?" Mike's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles showed white. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, scanning for something. "Not what," he said finally. "Who?" Before Richard could demand clarification, Mike continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper despite the fact they were alone on the open water. In '68, the Navy established Project Deepwater at this location. Officially, it was a program to test underwater demolition techniques in submarine rescue operations. He paused, checking their course before continuing. Unofficially, it was one of several black sites established to develop weapons that violated international agreements. Chemical agents, biological compounds, things that couldn't be tested on land without detection. Richard's mouth went dry. That container, storage facility for the most classified materials. When the project was shut down in '72, some equipment was too dangerous to transport back to shore, too unstable, too modified. Modified how? Mike's gaze finally met Richard's. I don't know exactly. I've only heard rumors. But the shadow figures you saw, the ones down there now, some say they're the original test subjects. Navy volunteers who were changed by what they helped create. Richard stared at his diving partner, searching for signs of delirium or oxygen toxicity. Anything to explain such an outlandish claim. But Mike's eyes were clear, his demeanor controlled despite the obvious tension. That's impossible, Richard said flatly. No one could survive underwater for 50 years. No one normal could, Mike agreed, but we just saw mechanical systems activate after half a century submerged. We felt energy pulses that affected our electronics in our bodies. Whatever they were working on down there, it wasn't bound by conventional limitations. The implications settled over Richard like a physical weight. Are you saying the government just left them there? Abandoned their own people? Officially, Project Deepwater never existed. The personnel assigned to it were listed as lost during routine training exercises. Mike's voice hardened. 47 men disappeared from official records between 1968 and 1972. Their families were told they died serving their country. In a way, I suppose that was true. Richard struggled to process the information. How do you know all this? Mike hesitated, his gaze returning to the horizon. Because my father was the project's security chief. He wasn't stationed underwater, but he knew what happened when things went wrong. He carried that knowledge to his grave. A heavy silence descended between them, broken only by the steady thrum of the boat's engines and the slap of waves against the hull. The ordinary world of blue sky and sunshine seemed impossibly disconnected from the nightmare they had witnessed below. What do we do now? Richard finally asked. Mike's expression darkened. We get back to shore. We destroy the evidence. We forget what we saw. Forget? Mike, there are people down there. They stopped being people a long time ago. Mike cut him off. And they've been contained underwater for 50 years for a reason. But now they're awake, Richard said quietly, and they know we found them. Mike said nothing, but his knuckles whitened on the wheel once more. In the distance, the shoreline emerged, the harbor, the marina, the normal world continuing in blissful ignorance of what lurked beneath the Gulf's placid surface. As they approached the dock, a new sound cut through the engine noise, the distinct thump of helicopter rotors. Richard turned to see a military chopper appearing from the east, its course set directly toward their position. They're coming for us, he realized aloud. Mike nodded grimly. I told you, people who find things that officially don't exist tend to face uncomfortable questions. And what do we do? Mike reached for the locked case Richard had noticed the previous night, entering a combination with practiced efficiency. The lid opened to reveal a satellite phone, several passports, and a thick envelope. We split up, Mike said, handing Richard one of the passports and half the cash from the envelope. You head west. I'll go north. Don't use credit cards. Don't contact anyone you know. In 3 days, call the number programmed into this phone. He handed Richard a basic flip phone from the case. You knew this might happen, Richard said, realization dawning. You were prepared for it. My father taught me to be ready for the day they might come looking. Mike's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry I got you involved in this, Hayes, but I needed to know if the rumors were true. You used me as bait, Richard understood suddenly. You needed someone to make the initial discovery. Mike didn't deny it. The site is monitored, has been for decades, but they watch for deliberate intrusions, military vessels, research submersibles, not a civilian truck driver on a recreational dive. Anger flashed through Richard, hot and sudden. You sent me down there alone knowing what might be waiting. I sent you to confirm the location, Mike corrected. I never expected you to get close enough to wake them. Before Richard could respond, the helicopter changed course slightly, accelerating toward the marina. They had minutes at most. Go, Mike urged, pressing the remaining equipment into Richard's hands. Dock at slip 35. There's a maintenance access that leads directly to the parking lot. Your truck keys are in the side pocket of your gear bag. What about you? I'll create a diversion, give you time to clear the area. Richard hesitated, torn between fury at the manipulation and gratitude for the escape plan. Why help me now? Why not just save yourself? Mike's eyes met his, unguarded for perhaps the first time since they'd met. Because what my father did, what the Navy did to those men, was wrong. And someone needs to survive to tell the truth. The helicopter was close enough now that Richard could make out the unmarked black fuselage, the tinted windows concealing its occupants. 3 days, Mike reminded him. The phone number. Don't forget. Richard nodded once, gathering the documents and phone. Good luck. You'll need it more than me, Mike replied grimly. Now go. As Richard slipped away toward the maintenance access, clutching his unexpected escape kit, the enormity of what they had discovered pressed down upon him. Railroad tracks on the ocean floor, leading to a facility housing weapons that violated international law. Men transformed into something no longer fully human, abandoned for half a century in a watery tomb, and now awakened. The ordinary world continued around him. Fishermen unloading their catch, tourists browsing souvenir shops, traffic flowing along coastal highways. None of them aware that beneath the sun-dappled waters of the Gulf, an impossible nightmare had stirred from decades of slumber. As he reached his truck and slipped the key into the ignition, Richard caught a glimpse of the helicopter touching down near the marina office. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with the coordinated precision of government agents. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The discovery had changed everything. For himself, for Mike. And perhaps, if the shadows beneath the waves were truly what Mike believed them to be, for everyone else as well. He pulled onto the highway, heading west as instructed. The familiar vibration of tires on asphalt surrounded him once more, the rhythm of the road that had defined his life for so many years. But for the first time, the open highway ahead offered no sense of freedom, only escape. 3 days into his westward flight, Richard Hayes found himself in a rundown motel outside Albuquerque, staring at walls the color of old cigarette smoke. The room's sparse furnishings, a sagging bed, a wobbly table, a television that only half worked, were a far cry from the comfortable cab of his truck. But at least here, he could disappear. He'd abandoned his rig at a long-term parking lot in Mobile, paying cash for 6 months in advance. The registration would eventually raise flags, but by then he hoped to be long gone, or long past caring about government abids searching for a truck driver who saw too much. Sleep had become a luxury he could rarely afford. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rusted rails stretching across the ocean floor, the massive container with its door hanging open like an invitation to nightmare, and those shadowy figures moving with impossible purpose after decades underwater. The flip phone Mike had given him remained silent, its battery conserved by keeping it powered off except for brief checks every few hours. 2 more days until he could call the program number. 2 more days of limbo. Unable to bear the confines of the motel room any longer, Richard ventured out. The desert air hit him with dry heat, so different from the humid Gulf Coast he'd left behind. He found an internet cafe tucked between a pawn shop and a liquor store, the kind of place that didn't ask questions or require ID. Sitting at a computer in the far corner, back to the wall with a clear view of the entrance, Richard began searching. His fingers hovered over the keyboard momentarily. Typing Project Deepwater directly seemed foolish, too easily traced. Instead, he started with broader queries. Gulf of Mexico naval testing sites 1960s, and underwater military installations Cold War era. The initial results were unremarkable. Declassified information about torpedo testing ranges, submarine monitoring stations, and acoustic research facilities. Nothing about railroad tracks leading to underwater containers. Nothing about men left behind. He refined his search, looking into naval personnel losses during the late 1960s. Here, patterns began to emerge. Between 1968 and 1972, the Navy had reported an unusually high number of training accidents in the Gulf region. 47 men, just as Mike had said, listed as casualties in incidents that received minimal press coverage and almost no follow-up investigation. One name caught his attention. Commander Robert Donovan, listed as killed during a routine training exercise in August 1970. The same surname as Mike. the father who had carried knowledge to his grave. Richard clicked through to a digitized newspaper archive, finding a brief obituary with a grainy photograph. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same strong jaw, the same steady gaze, though the elder Donavois's eyes held none of the haunted quality that Richard had glimpsed in Mike's. Following this thread, Richard discovered a doctoral dissertation written 15 years ago by a marine historian at the University of Florida. Classified naval operations in the Gulf of Mexico, gaps in the official record, 1965 to 1975. The full text required university credentials he didn't have, but the abstract mentions significant discrepancies in personnel accounting and evidence of undisclosed testing facilities. The author's name, Dr. Sarah Weiss, and her university affiliation were listed at the bottom of the page. Someone who had already been asking the right questions, long before Richard stumbled upon rusted rails beneath the waves. He hesitated only briefly before typing her name into the search bar. The results showed she now worked as a researcher at the Gulf Coast Maritime Museum in Pensacola, specializing in naval history. Her biography mentioned multiple publications on classified Cold War naval operations. An ally, perhaps, someone who might believe his story, or a trap. Richard printed the information about Dr. Weiss, along with several articles about the naval training accidents, then cleared his browsing history and paid in cash. As he stepped back into the harsh sunlight, a black SUV with tinted windows rolled slowly past the cafe. Coincidence, he told himself. Paranoia was the natural companion of fugitives. But he took a circuitous route back to the motel nonetheless. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by dreams of dark water and shadowy figures reaching with impossibly elongated limbs. He woke gasping, sheets damp with sweat despite the room's air conditioning. 2 days. Just 2 more days until he could call Mike. He spent the following day in careful preparation, purchasing a used motorcycle with cash, transferring his limited belongings to saddlebags, memorizing routes east and west from his current location. The less he relied on GPS or electronic navigation, the harder he would be to track. When the appointed day finally arrived, Richard waited until exactly noon, the time Mike had specified, before powering on the flip phone. He dialed the single number programmed into its memory, heart pounding as it rang once, twice, 3 times. Hayes, Mike's voice tense but alive. Relief flooded through Richard. You made it. So far, are you secure? As much as I can be. What's happening? A hesitation on the line. They're looking for us, naval intelligence primarily. They've classified us as persons of interest in a national security matter. What about the site, the container? Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, there's been increased activity in the Gulf, research vessels, Navy ships running patterns that don't match their filed plans. Richard closed his eyes, seeing again the container doors swinging open, the blue glow emanating from within. It's awake now, isn't it? Whatever was down there. Yes, the word fell like a stone. But that's not why I had you call. There's someone you need to contact. Someone who can help us understand what we found. Dr. Sarah Weiss, Richard guessed. A startled silence. How did you? I've been doing my own research. Found her work on undocumented naval operations in the Gulf. A low chuckle, tinged with genuine amusement. You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for, Hayes. I drive trucks. Doesn't mean I'm stupid. Fair enough. Mike's tone sobered. Yes, Weiss is our best shot. She's been investigating Project Deepwater for years, though she doesn't know it by that name. She calls it Operation Charybdis in her papers, the code name used in some of the declassified adjacent projects. Can we trust her? As much as we can trust anyone. Her father was one of the scientists who objected to the project's direction. He was reassigned and later died under suspicious circumstances. She's been looking for answers ever since. Richard considered this. Shared grief and suspicion could create powerful alliances or dangerous blind spots. How do I contact her? Not by phone or email, too easily monitored. You'll need to approach her in person, but carefully. She's being watched too. By the same people looking for us? Most likely, the Gulf Coast Maritime Museum in Pensacola. She gives public tours every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Attend as a tourist, approach her afterward. Use the phrase, I'm interested in the Charybdis tide patterns. She'll know it's significant. And if she turns me in, then I've misjudged her and we're both screwed. Mike's voice hardened. But we need allies, Hayes. We can't handle this alone. After finalizing details and contingency plans, the call ended with Mike's firm instruction: destroy the phone. Richard removed the battery and SIM card, crushing each separately before disposing of them in different locations around the city. The journey to Pensacola would take days on back roads, avoiding main highways and their ubiquitous cameras. As he prepared the motorcycle for departure, Richard contemplated the bizarre turn his life had taken. 2 weeks ago, he had been a simple truck driver whose greatest concern was making delivery deadlines. Now he was a fugitive, hunted by shadowy government agencies for discovering something that officially didn't exist. And yet, beneath the fear and uncertainty, a strange sense of purpose had taken root. For the first time in years, Richard Hayes was doing something that mattered, uncovering a truth buried beneath decades of official denial and deliberate forgetfulness. Whatever awaited him in Pensacola, whatever Dr. Weiss might reveal about Project Deepwater, one thing was certain: he could never return to the simple life he had known before. The rails had led him too far from shore, too deep into waters where ordinary men were not meant to tread. The coastal highway to Pensacola offered glimpses of the Gulf, the same waters that now held secrets Richard couldn't forget. 5 days of careful travel had brought him to the outskirts of the city, where he checked into another anonymous motel using another false name. The day was Tuesday. Tomorrow he would meet Dr. Sarah Weiss. That evening he walked to a local library using their public computer to research the Gulf Coast Maritime Museum. The facility occupied a renovated naval warehouse on the harbor, showcasing the region's maritime history with special emphasis on military operations during World War II and the Cold War. Dr. Weiss's tour was listed as Classified Operations, the Secret Naval History of the Gulf, limited to 20 participants. Richard arrived at the museum an hour before the scheduled tour, purchasing a ticket with cash and wandering through the exhibits to establish himself as an ordinary visitor. The displays of naval vessels, submarine models, and vintage diving equipment now held a macabre fascination, each artifact a reminder of the world that had created and then abandoned Project Deepwater. At precisely 2 p.m., a woman's voice called for tour participants to gather near the Cold War exhibit. Dr. Sarah Weiss was younger than Richard had expected, early 40s perhaps, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp, observant eyes behind simple glasses. She wore the museum's polo shirt and khakis, but carried herself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to academic settings. Welcome to our special exhibition on classified naval operations in the Gulf of Mexico, she began, surveying the small group. Much of what I'll share today has only been declassified within the past decade. Some details remain redacted, some questions unanswered. Her gaze paused briefly on Richard, a flicker of assessment before moving on. Had she noticed something different about him? Or was his paranoia showing? The tour proceeded through displays of sonar systems, underwater listening posts, and scale models of research vessels disguised as fishing boats. Dr. Weiss explained each with the precision of someone who had studied declassified documents word by word, searching for hidden meanings between heavily redacted lines. The Gulf was essentially an underwater laboratory during the Cold War, she explained, stopping before a map marked with dots representing known testing sites. The Soviets had their testing grounds in the Black Sea. We had ours here. The difference was population density. Millions lived along the Black Sea coasts, while the Gulf offered relatively isolated waters for projects requiring discretion. A tourist raised his hand. What kind of projects needed that much secrecy? Dr. Weiss's expression remained professional, but Richard noted a tightening around her eyes. Officially, acoustic research, submarine detection systems, and underwater demolition techniques. Unofficially, she paused. Well, that's where historians like myself continue to find gaps in the record. Between 1965 and 1975, naval expenditures for Gulf operations increased by 340, yet the documented projects account for less than half that budget. Black budget operations, someone else suggested. That's the most likely explanation, she agreed. The question is, what were those operations? And why do they remain classified 50 years later? As the tour continued, Richard listened intently, not just to the information, but to the way Dr. Weiss presented it. The careful emphasis on certain dates, the deliberate pauses when discussing personnel losses, the slight edge in her voice when mentioning redacted documents. She knew more than she was saying in this public forum. When the tour concluded an hour later, the group dispersed toward the museum's main exhibits. Richard lingered, examining a display case containing diving equipment from the 1960s. Dr. Weiss approached, clipboard in hand. "Did you enjoy the tour, Reynolds?" he supplied, using his current alias. "Very informative. Actually, I'm interested in the Charybdis tide patterns. I've been researching similar phenomena." The change was subtle but immediate. Her professional smile remained, but her eyes sharpened with heightened focus. "That's a very specialized interest. Our research library has limited material on those patterns. Perhaps we could discuss your specific questions in my office?" She led him through a staff door and down a corridor to a small office overlooking the harbor. Maps and charts covered one wall. Bookshelves lined with academic texts and bound documents occupied another. She closed the door and turned to face him. "You're not a historian," she stated flatly. "Who sent you?" "Mike Donovan." Recognition flickered across her face. "Robert Donovan's son, the naval security officer." "You know him?" "I know of him. His father's death was one of the 47 I've been investigating for years." She studied Richard with new intensity. "But you're not military or intelligence. Who are you and why are you here?" Richard took a deep breath. "My name is Richard Hayes. I'm a commercial truck driver with a diving hobby. And 2 weeks ago, I found something at the bottom of the Gulf that apparently doesn't officially exist." For the next 20 minutes, Richard recounted everything: finding the rails, his first glimpse of the container, Mike's involvement, their joint dive, the awakening of the abandoned facility, and their subsequent flight from authorities. Dr. Weiss listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock to grim confirmation. When he finished, she turned to her computer, typing rapidly. "I need to show you something." She pulled up a scanned document, partially redacted but still legible. "This is from my father's personal papers. He was a marine biologist contracted by the Navy in 1967 for what was initially described as environmental impact studies in the Gulf. 6 months in, he realized he was actually supporting a classified weapons development program." The document appeared to be a personal journal entry dated March 1969. "Project progressing beyond established parameters. Subjects showing concerning adaptations to experimental compounds. Donovan shares my reservations, but command insists we continue. Ethical considerations being systematically overlooked. Must document everything in case." The entry ended abruptly. "My father was reassigned 2 weeks after writing this," Dr. Weiss explained. 3 months later, he died in what was officially ruled an accident. I was 12 years old." She pulled up another document, a personnel list with most names redacted. "The project he was working on never appeared in declassified records, but I found references to it in adjacent programs, always under different code names, always with key details missing: Charybdis, Nautilus, Deepwater." Richard leaned forward. "Mike called it Project Deepwater. That tracks with what I've pieced together." She turned to face him directly. "Mr. Hayes, what you and Donovan found wasn't just a weapons cache. Based on my research, it was an experimental facility for testing human adaptation to deep water environments." "What kind of adaptations?" Her expression darkened. "The kind that would allow naval personnel to operate underwater indefinitely, without conventional diving equipment, biological modifications, chemical enhancements, possibly even genetic alterations, though the technology was primitive by today's standards." The implications settled like a weight on Richard's chest. "The shadow figures we saw, test subjects," she confirmed grimly. "Volunteers, most likely, though how informed their consent was remains questionable. When the project was terminated in 1972, the official record shows all equipment was removed and the site was abandoned." "But they left people down there," Richard said, the horror of it finally sinking in completely. "Not people, not anymore." Her voice dropped. At least that's what my father believed. His last communication to my mother, a letter that arrived after his death, mentioned subjects too far gone to be returned to society. He was trying to force the Navy to provide ongoing care and monitoring. Instead, they shut everything down and buried the evidence. Literally. Richard recalled the container doors swinging open after decades underwater, the blue glow emanating from within, the mechanical systems activating at their presence. They've been down there all this time, alive somehow, and now they're awake. Dr. Weiss nodded soberly, which explains the increased naval activity in the Gulf. They're responding to a containment breach of something they hoped would remain dormant forever. What do they want, these subjects? I don't know. She closed the document files, her movements deliberate, but I suspect we should be less concerned with what they want and more concerned with what the Navy will do to prevent their existence from becoming public knowledge. A knock at the office door interrupted them. Dr. Weiss called, "Just a moment," while quickly shutting down her computer. "Meet me tonight," she whispered urgently. "Pelican Harbor, slip 23, 9 p.m. I have more information that isn't digitized." Richard nodded as she opened the door to find a museum security guard. "Dr. Weiss, there are two gentlemen from Naval Historical Services asking to speak with you. They say it's regarding your recent document requests." Her smile remained perfectly composed. "Of course, I'll be right there." She turned to Richard. "Thank you for your interest in our maritime history, Mr. Reynolds. The gift shop has several excellent books on Gulf Coast shipwrecks you might enjoy." The dismissal was clear and timely. Through the office window, Richard glimpsed two men in civilian clothes waiting in the lobby, their rigid posture and alert scanning of the room betraying military or intelligence backgrounds. He thanked her and exited through a side door, avoiding the lobby entirely. Outside, he circled the building and observed from across the street as the men escorted Dr. Weiss to a conference room. Their manner wasn't overtly threatening, but the deliberate positioning, one ahead, one behind, suggested she wasn't being given a choice about the meeting. Richard retreated to his motel, mind racing with the implications of what he'd learned. Not just weapons, but human experimentation. Not just abandoned equipment, but abandoned men. The Cold War had produced many dark chapters, but this one seemed particularly nightmarish. Subjects too far gone to be returned to society, left to exist in an underwater tomb for half a century, and now awake, active, perhaps angry. As dusk settled over Pensacola, Richard prepared for the meeting at Pelican Harbor. He traveled light, only essential documents, the cash remaining from Mike's emergency envelope, and a prepaid phone purchased that afternoon. The lingering humidity clung to his skin as he approached the marina, scanning for surveillance before proceeding to slip 23. A small cabin cruiser rocked gently in the berth, its white hull gleaming in the security lights. No sign of Dr. Weiss yet. Richard checked his watch. 8:45 p.m. He was early, intentionally so, to ensure the meeting point wasn't compromised. From his position in the shadows of a nearby maintenance shed, he had clear sight lines to all marina entrances. At precisely 9, Dr. Weiss appeared, walking purposefully along the dock. She had changed from her museum uniform to jeans and a dark jacket, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Richard waited until she reached the boat before emerging from concealment. "Dr. Weiss." She turned sharply, tension visible in her stance until she recognized him. "Mr. Hayes, good, we don't have much time." They boarded the cabin cruiser, and she immediately led him below deck to a small but organized living space. Charts and documents covered the fold-down table, alongside a laptop and external hard drives. "You live here?" Richard asked, noting the lived-in quality of the space. "For the past month. After my last document request was flagged, I thought it prudent to have mobile accommodations." She indicated the charts. "These are bathymetric surveys of the Gulf floor from 1965 through 1975. Watch what happens here." She pointed to an area roughly matching the coordinates where Richard had found the underwater rails. In the 1965 survey, it showed as a natural depression in the seabed. By 1968, the depression had been expanded and deepened. The 1972 survey showed a different topography entirely, a flat platform where the depression had been, extending into deeper waters. "They built something substantial, then deliberately covered it when the project ended," she explained. "These surveys were never classified because individually, They just show changing seafloor formations, not unusual in the Gulf. It's only when you compare them sequentially that the pattern emerges. She pulled out another document, a shipping manifest with multiple redactions. This is from a cargo vessel that operated exclusively for naval transport in 1968. It lists the delivery of specialized construction materials, including modified rail systems and prefabricated containment units to a set of coordinates matching our site. Richard studied the manifest. No mention of what the containment units were for. No, but this might help. She produced a faded photograph showing a group of men in naval uniforms standing before what appeared to be a partially constructed platform. My father kept this hidden in his personal effects. It's the only known image of the project site during construction. The photo quality was poor, but Richard could make out rail lines being installed on what looked like an underwater foundation. In the background, large cylindrical tanks were being positioned by divers. Those aren't weapon containers, he noted. No, based on my father's notes, they were habitation chambers, designed for long-term human occupation in a pressurized underwater environment. Richard felt a chill despite the cabin's warmth. They built living quarters. They planned for people to stay down there. Initially as a research facility with rotating personnel, but something changed around 1970. She pulled out a thin folder labeled only with a date. This is the last communication my father sent before his reassignment. I've spent years decoding his deliberately obscured language. The document was a technical report on physiological adaptations in deep water environments, much of it couched in scientific terminology. But certain passages jumped out with disturbing clarity. Subjects 1217 showing accelerated gill development after compound B7 treatment. Lung function diminishing, but oxygen absorption through modified epithelial tissues exceeding expectations. Skeletal density increasing to withstand pressure differentials. And later, Command has authorized permanent deployment protocols for advanced subjects. Ethical concerns regarding subject consent and reversibility of modifications overruled by operational requirements. Donovan has requested formal review by MedCom, but approval unlikely given project classification level. Richard looked up from the document, stomach churning. They were transforming them, deliberately, into something that could live underwater indefinitely, Dr. Weiss confirmed. The perfect Cold War operatives, able to sabotage enemy submarines, plant underwater listening devices, or deploy weapons from the seabed without ever surfacing. But something went wrong. She nodded grimly. The modifications progressed beyond their control. The subjects began developing unexpected adaptations, physical and possibly psychological changes that weren't part of the original protocols. And rather than admit failure, they sealed them away. Richard's voice hardened with disgust. Left them in an underwater cage and pretended they never existed. The perfect black project. No paper trail, no witnesses, no accountability. Dr. Weiss's expression reflected decades of frustrated investigation. Until you stumbled across their tomb and woke them up. The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. If these modified subjects had survived 50 years in an underwater container, what had they become? What capabilities had they developed? And now that they were active again, what would they do? A sudden vibration rattled the small cabin. Not an explosion, but a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come through the water itself, transmitted through the boat's hull. Dr. Weiss froze. Did you feel that? Richard nodded, the sensation uncomfortably familiar, the same pressure wave he had experienced during the dive, just before the container had fully activated. Another pulse, stronger this time, making the charts on the table tremble. From above deck came shouts of confusion as other boat owners felt the disturbance. It's them, Richard said with certainty, the same energy signature from the container. Dr. Weiss rushed to her laptop, pulling up a NOAA website tracking seismic activity in the Gulf. There's nothing registered, no earthquakes, no underwater landslides. Because it's not natural. Richard moved toward the cabin steps. We need to see what's happening. They emerged onto the deck to find marina residents gathered along the docks, pointing out toward the open water. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles offshore, a strange phenomenon was visible even in the darkness. A circular pattern of phosphorescence, pulsing with unnatural regularity. Dr. Weiss grabbed binoculars from a deck compartment, focusing on the disturbance. That's not normal bioluminescence. It's too organized, too rhythmic. She handed the binoculars to Richard. Through them, he could see that the glow emanated not from the surface but from below, a powerful blue-green light source deep underwater, its radiance filtering upward in concentric circles that expanded with each pulse. It's a signal, he realized aloud. They're broadcasting something. Or activating something else, Dr. Weiss suggested, her voice tense. As if in confirmation, a new disturbance appeared. Smaller points of light moving beneath the surface, traveling from the main source toward the shore. Not random movements, but coordinated patterns, like underwater vehicles following predetermined paths. Richard lowered the binoculars, a cold certainty settling in his gut. They're coming ashore. Before Dr. Weiss could respond, the marina's lights flickered and died, plunging the docks into darkness broken only by boat running, lights, and the distant glow from shore establishments. Confused voices rose around them as people reached for flashlights and emergency lamps. Electromagnetic pulse, Dr. Weiss whispered. The same technology my father mentioned in his later notes. They were developing ways to disable electronic systems from underwater positions. Richard's mind raced through implications. If they can project that kind of energy, they could disable power grids, communication systems, transportation networks, all from beneath the waves, without ever being detected. The academic detachment in her voice had given way to genuine fear. We need to warn someone. Who? The same Navy that abandoned them? The same government agencies now hunting us for finding them? Richard shook his head. We'd be detained before we could explain anything. A new sound cut through the confusion. Helicopter rotors approaching rapidly from the east. Searchlights swept across the marina as two military helicopters appeared, hovering low over the water where the strange lights had been seen. They're already responding, Dr. Weiss noted. They must have monitoring systems in place, which means they'll be looking for anyone who knows about Project Deepwater. Richard gripped her arm. We need to move. Now. As if confirming his urgency, a third helicopter appeared, this one sweeping its searchlight directly across the marina slips. Behind it, vehicles with government plates began arriving at the marina entrance, disgorging personnel and tactical gear. Not just routine monitoring, Dr. Weiss realized. They're actively searching. For us, Richard confirmed. They know we've connected. They quickly gathered essential documents and hard drives, securing them in waterproof bags. Dr. Weiss accessed a hidden compartment beneath the cabin floor, retrieving a small firearm and additional cash. There's a service channel behind the marina, she explained, leading him to the rear of the boat. Small craft only, runs parallel to the main harbor. We can take the dinghy. They lowered the small inflatable boat on the side away from the approaching authorities, using the cabin cruiser for cover. The outboard motor was electric, silent and less detectable than gas engines. As they slipped away from the dock, staying close to the shadows of larger vessels, Richard glanced back toward the open gulf. The pulsing light had dimmed, but the smaller moving lights continued their deliberate progression toward shore. Whatever had awakened beneath the waves was no longer content to remain in its underwater tomb. It was coming, for what purpose, he couldn't guess. But the immediate danger came from behind them, where the methodical search of the marina continued, closing in on Slip 23. Dr. Weiss guided the dinghy through the narrow service channel, her knowledge of local waterways proving invaluable as they navigated the darkness without running lights. Only when they had reached a secondary inlet, hidden from the main harbor by a stand of mangroves, did she cut the motor. There's a marine research station 2 miles up this channel, she whispered. Automated, no permanent staff. We can use it temporarily. Richard nodded, helping her secure the dinghy as they waded ashore. The humid night air clung to them, mosquitoes buzzing in clouds around their heads as they made their way through thick vegetation toward a small compound visible in the distance. Behind them, the helicopters continued their search pattern over the marina and surrounding waters. But a new sound had joined them, sirens, multiple and urgent, racing toward the shoreline. Whatever had been set in motion beneath the gulf was accelerating now, spreading like ripples from a stone cast into still water. And Richard Hayes, truck driver, diver, accidental discoverer of buried secrets, found himself at the center of a widening circle of consequences that threatened to engulf not just his life, but perhaps many others. The research station appeared as a low, concrete building surrounded by scientific equipment, weather monitors, water quality sensors, and automated sampling devices. Dr. Weiss approached the keypad by the main door, entering a code that unlocked the facility. University Consortium Access, she explained. All researchers in the coastal program have clearance. Inside, the station was utilitarian, a main laboratory space, small sleeping quarters, and a communications room filled with monitoring equipment. The power remained on, suggesting the EMP that had affected the marina had been localized or directional. Dr. Weiss immediately went to the communications console, activating a satellite feed that showed real-time images of the Gulf. The resolution was poor, designed for tracking weather patterns, not underwater anomalies, but clear enough to show unusual disturbances approaching multiple points along the coastline. They're coordinating, she observed, tracking the movement patterns. Not random, not panicked. This is a deliberate operation. Richard studied the displays, recognition dawning. They're following underwater infrastructure. Look, those paths align with fiber optic cables, others with pipeline routes. Strategic targets, Dr. Weiss agreed. If they disable those systems simultaneously, the implications hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. A coordinated attack on underwater infrastructure could cripple communications, energy distribution, and transportation systems across the Gulf Coast. We need to contact Mike, Richard decided. He has military connections, people who might listen without immediately detaining it. Dr. Weiss hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Use this. She handed him a satellite phone from the station's emergency equipment. Less traceable than cellular networks, especially now. Richard dialed the number Mike had made him memorize, different from the one he'd called previously. 3 rings, then a click. Identify, came Mike's terse voice. Hayes, I'm with Dr. Weiss. We have a situation developing across the Gulf Coast. A brief silence, then, I know. I'm tracking it from my position. Multiple coastal installations reporting power fluctuations and communication disruptions. Navy and Coast Guard mobilizing, but they're keeping it quiet. No public alerts yet. It's them, Mike, the subjects from Project Deepwater. They're active and moving toward shore. I figured as much when I saw the pattern. Mike's voice was grim. This is why the container was sealed and the facility deactivated. They feared exactly this scenario. What do they want? Richard asked, voicing the question that had haunted him since learning the truth about the abandoned experiment. To return to the world that discarded them, Mike replied, his tone suggesting he had considered this question deeply. Or to ensure that world can never hurt them again. We need to warn people, Dr. Weiss interjected, leaning toward the phone. Coastal communities, at minimum. And tell them what? Mike challenged. That modified Navy personnel from a classified 1960s experiment are emerging from the deep? We'd be dismissed as lunatics or arrested as security risks. Then what do we do? Richard demanded. We need evidence, Mike decided. Concrete proof that connects what's happening now to Project Deepwater. Something that forces acknowledgement rather than denial. Dr. Weiss's expression shifted, determination replacing uncertainty. My father's complete records. He duplicated everything before his reassignment, encrypted it, and hid it where only I would know to look. I've never retrieved it because the risk was too great without knowing the full scope of what he was documenting. Where? Mike asked. A safety deposit box in Birmingham, under my mother's maiden name. That's hundreds of miles inland, Richard pointed out. Exactly why he chose it. Far from naval jurisdiction, in a conservative bank that wouldn't easily yield to government pressure without proper warrants. Mike's voice sharpened with urgency. Get those records. I'll arrange secure transport once you have them. But move fast. They'll figure out our connection soon if they haven't already. As the call ended, the satellite feed on the monitoring station flickered, showing new disturbances along the coast. Power outages were spreading in coastal communities, creating patches of darkness visible from orbit. We need to leave immediately, Dr. Weiss said, gathering their essential documents. Take only what's irreplaceable. Travel light and fast. As they prepared to depart, a low, resonant pulse vibrated through the research station, similar to what they had felt at the marina, but stronger, more focused. The monitoring equipment squealed with feedback before shutting down completely, screens going dark one by one. Through the station's windows, Richard saw the lights of nearby coastal homes blinking out in succession, darkness spreading inland like an advancing tide. Whatever energy the modified subjects were projecting, its range and power were growing. They're expanding their reach, Dr. Weiss observed, voice tight with urgency. Testing their capabilities, perhaps, or preparing for something larger. Richard shouldered their waterproof pack, mind racing through options. We can't take the coastal highway, it'll be the first thing they secure. We need to move inland, find alternate routes to Birmingham. As they slipped out of the research station into the humid darkness, the night sky above the Gulf was lit by multiple helicopter searchlights sweeping the waters. Military and Coast Guard vessels had begun forming a perimeter, their running lights visible as a thin line separating land from sea. But the true boundary had already been breached. Whatever had awakened in that underwater container was no longer contained, no longer hidden. And as Richard and Dr. Weiss disappeared into the coastal underbrush, heading inland toward answers that might come too late, the pieces of a 50-year-old puzzle were finally connecting, revealing a picture more terrifying than either of them had imagined. Their escape from the research station proved more difficult than anticipated. The power outage had triggered emergency protocols across the region, with police and emergency personnel establishing checkpoints on major roads. Traveling on foot through the dense coastal vegetation, Richard and Dr. Weiss made slow progress, guided only by the compass on her diving watch and the distant glow of helicopter searchlights behind them. "We need transportation," Richard muttered as they paused in a small clearing to catch their breath. "At this rate, we'll never reach Birmingham before they lock down the entire region." Dr. Weiss nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "There's a small marina about 2 miles inland, mostly recreational boaters, fishermen. We might find something there." They pressed on, the humid night air thick with mosquitoes and the distant sound of sirens. Above them, stars punctuated the cloudless sky, indifferent witnesses to the crisis unfolding below. Richard found himself constantly looking back toward the coast, half expecting to see shadowy figures pursuing them through the darkness. When they finally reached the inland marina, a modest collection of docks extending into a narrow tributary of the coastal waterway, most of the area remained without power. A few boat owners had activated emergency generators, creating islands of light in the darkness. "Follow my lead," Dr. Weiss whispered as they approached, "and let me do the talking." She transformed before Richard's eyes, her tense posture relaxing into the casual confidence of someone who belonged. Approaching an older man securing his fishing boat for the night, she called out with forced cheerfulness. "Evening. Power's out all over, huh? My husband and I are trying to get back to our place in Mobile. Our car's dead. Think anyone here might give us a lift, at least partway? We can pay." The fisherman studied them suspiciously in the beam of his flashlight. "Roads are blocked. Police saying there's been some kind of attack on the power grid." "Attack?" Dr. Weiss feigned surprise. "Who would attack Pensacola?" The man shrugged. "They ain't saying, just that people should stay put. Homeland Security's involved now." Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. If Homeland Security was mobilizing, the situation was escalating beyond local authorities. The modified subjects from Project Deepwater had triggered a national security response. "Well, we really need to get home," Dr. Weiss insisted. "Our daughter's alone with my sister, and she's sick. We've got to get back." The fisherman's expression softened slightly. "Can't help you myself. I'm staying with my boat. But Carl over there," he gestured toward a middle-aged man loading supplies onto a small motorboat. "He's heading up to Bayou La Batre. Might take you that far if you ask nice." Dr. Weiss thanked him, leading Richard toward the indicated boat. The negotiation with Carl was brief but expensive, $500 in cash for a ride that would take them 30 miles up the coast, away from the immediate security zone around Pensacola. As they motored slowly through the darkened waterway, careful to avoid other vessels in the absence of running lights, Richard studied the night sky. The helicopter activity had intensified, searchlights sweeping methodically across the coastal waters in an expanding grid pattern. They're looking for them, he said quietly. The subjects. Carl, overhearing, misinterpreted. Looking for terrorists, more like. Word at the marina is some foreign outfit attacked our underwater cables. Internet's down all across the Gulf Coast. Weiss exchanged a meaningful glance with Richard. The subjects weren't just disabling local systems, they were attacking strategic infrastructure. And the authorities were already constructing a cover story to explain the disruptions without revealing the true source. Any reports of unusual sightings in the water? Richard asked carefully. Carl snorted. Bobby Tanner swears he saw something swimming that wasn't no fish or dolphin. But Bobby sees the Loch Ness Monster every time he has more than 3 beers, so nobody pays him much mind. The journey to Bayou La Batre took nearly 2 hours, the small boat making slow progress against the current. When they finally docked at a small commercial pier, the area was eerily quiet. The power outage had reached here too, leaving the fishing community dark except for occasional generator-powered lights. Far as I go, Carl announced, securing the boat. Town's about half a mile that way. Might find a ride north from there, but don't count on it with the roads being checked. They thanked him and set off toward the town, traveling light but burdened by the knowledge they carried. The documents in Dr. Weiss's waterproof pack might hold the key to understanding what was happening and perhaps stopping it before the situation escalated further. The small coastal town was in a state of controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles moved through darkened streets, their lights casting eerie shadows against the buildings. A makeshift command center had been established at the fire station, where officials consulted maps and communicated via battery-powered radios. Richard and Dr. Weiss skirted the center of town, avoiding official attention. At a small gas station on the outskirts, they found their opportunity, a long-haul trucker preparing to depart despite the unusual circumstances. Highway patrols letting commercial vehicles through, the heavy-set driver explained when Dr. Weiss approached with their cover story about needing to reach Birmingham. Got medical supplies that need delivering. They can turn back pleasure drivers all they want, but freight's got to move. For another $500, he agreed to let them ride in his cab as far as Montgomery, more than halfway to Birmingham. Richard felt a strange comfort climbing into the familiar environment of a truck cab, the diesel engine's rumble, a reminder of his former life. As they pulled onto the highway, he gazed back toward the coast. The glow of searchlights was still visible, concentrated now on specific areas. Whatever was happening in the Gulf, the authorities were zeroing in on it. What do you think they'll do when they find them? He asked quietly, once the trucker had turned up his radio and was unlikely to overhear. Dr. Weiss's expression was grim in the dashboard lights. Eliminate the evidence. It's what they tried to do 50 years ago, only this time they'll make sure it's permanent. These were American servicemen, Richard protested, volunteers, who no longer exist in any official record, she reminded him, and who are no longer fully human if my father's notes are accurate. They're living proof of illegal human experimentation by the U.S. military, a public relations nightmare, and a legal catastrophe if exposed. Richard fell silent, contemplating the brutal logic. The modified subjects represented a threat on multiple levels: physical danger to coastal communities, strategic risk to infrastructure, and existential risk to the institutions that had created and abandoned them. From the government's perspective, there was only one acceptable outcome: complete erasure. The truck rumbled through the night, passing occasional checkpoints where commercial vehicles were indeed being waved through with minimal scrutiny. Richard and Dr. Weiss kept their heads down, playing the roles of exhausted passengers as state troopers peered briefly into the cab before moving on. Outside Montgomery, they parted ways with the trucker, using the last of Mike's emergency cash to purchase a used car from a 24-hour pawn shop. By dawn, they were approaching Birmingham, the skyline emerging through the morning haze. The bank won't open until 9, Dr. Weiss noted, checking her watch. We should find somewhere to rest and clean up. We look like fugitives. Richard caught his reflection in the rearview mirror and had to agree. Unshaven, clothes dirty from their trek through coastal vegetation, dark circles under his eyes. He looked exactly like a man running from the law, which technically he was. They found a budget motel on the outskirts of the city, paying cash for a room with 2 beds. The power was on in Birmingham, the crisis apparently confined to the coastal regions for now. The motel's ancient television revealed nothing about the situation in Pensacola, only vague reports of infrastructure disruptions affecting parts of the Gulf Coast, attributed to possible cyber attacks. They're controlling the narrative, Dr. Weiss observed, flipping through news channels that all carried variations of the same limited information. Standard protocol for containing knowledge of classified incidents. Richard showered and changed into clean clothes they had purchased at a 24-hour discount store. As he waited for Dr. Weiss to do the same, he tried Mike's secure number again. Situation? Mike answered without preamble. We're in Birmingham, going to retrieve Dr. Weiss's father's records this morning. What's happening on the coast? Mike's voice was tight with tension. They've made contact. Naval Special Forces engaged with multiple entities near Pensacola Bay around 0300 hours. Casualties reported, but details classified. Richard's chest tightened. The subjects are fighting back? Apparently, and they're not as easy to neutralize as command expected. A pause. These aren't confused experiments stumbling ashore, Hayes. They're organized, coordinated, in employing advanced tactics. The initial unit that engaged them was, I don't have details, but the word decimated was used. My God. The official story is still cyber terrorism, but they've expanded the evacuation zone to 10 miles inland along the affected coastline. Homeland Security has established a unified command with DoD. Department of Defense is involved now. This went military the moment those things demonstrated offensive capabilities. Mike's voice dropped. They're deploying hardware I can't discuss on this line, but it's serious. End of situation type serious. Richard understood the implication. The government was prepared to eliminate the threat with extreme prejudice, regardless of collateral damage. An isolated stretch of coastline could be sacrificed if necessary, the incident later attributed to terrorist action or natural disaster. We need to move faster, he told Dr. Weiss when she emerged from the bathroom. They're escalating the response on the coast. Military hardware being deployed. She nodded grimly, gathering their few possessions. The bank opens in 30 minutes. First National on Highland Avenue. My father's records are in a safety deposit box under the name Elizabeth Carleton, my mother's maiden name. The bank was a grand old building of marble and brass, a relic of Birmingham's prosperous past. They arrived just as the doors opened, joining a small queue of early customers. Dr. Weiss approached the service desk alone, Richard maintaining distance as agreed, ready to leave separately if anything went wrong. He watched as she presented identification and spoke with the manager, her body language conveying casual confidence despite the stakes. After what seemed an eternity, she was escorted to the safety deposit vault. Richard pretended to fill out deposit slips, heart pounding as minutes ticked by. Had the authorities flagged her identity? Was she being detained in some back room while police were called? 20 minutes later, she emerged, a slim briefcase in hand, nodding slightly to Richard as she exited the bank. He waited 5 minutes before following, meeting her at the predetermined location, a coffee shop across the street. Got it, she confirmed quietly as he sat down. All his records, just as he promised my mother. Project documentation, research notes, subject profiles, everything the Navy thought they'd purged. Now we contact Mike for extraction? She nodded, but her expression remained troubled. There's something else, something I found while scanning the documents in the viewing room. She opened the briefcase just enough to slide a photograph across the table. It showed a group of men in naval uniforms, test subjects, based on the clinical identifying numbers visible on their clothing. Young men, most in their 20s, standing at attention before what appeared to be the underwater facility. Look at the third man from the left, she instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard studied the face, strong features, determined expression, a certain hardness around the eyes that suggested someone accustomed to difficult decisions. Recognition dawned slowly, then hit with the force of a physical blow. That's Mike. He looked up in confusion. But this is from 1969. He'd have been a child. Not Mike, Dorweiss corrected softly. Commander Michael Donovan, Test Subject 17, one of the volunteers who underwent the complete modification protocol. Richard stared at the photograph, mind reeling. But Mike said his father was the security chief, that he died in 1970. Commander Robert Donovan was the security chief, she confirmed. But according to these records, his son Michael was one of the volunteers in the final test group, the one my father described as too far gone to be returned to society. The implications crashed over Richard in waves of horrified understanding. Mike hadn't been feeding him information about Project Deepwater from old family connections or classified sources. He had been there. He was one of them. All this time, Richard whispered, he's been what? Monitoring the situation? Watching for signs of the facility's reactivation? Weiss nodded slowly. It appears some of the subjects weren't contained in the underwater facility. The most successful adaptations, those who could still pass for human, may have been allowed to live in society under strict supervision, as sleeper agents monitoring for the others, or as insurance, living proof that could be revealed if the project was ever exposed. She gathered the photograph, returning it to the briefcase. Whatever his role, the Mike Donovan you know isn't who he claims to be, and his interest in your discovery goes far beyond historical curiosity. Richard sat back, trying to process this new revelation. The man who had guided him to the underwater facility, who had fled with him from authorities, who had directed him to Dr. Weiss, was himself a product of Project Deepwater. Perhaps even the project's most successful result, a modified human who could live undetected among ordinary people. We need to rethink everything, he decided. Every piece of information he's given us, every instruction, every plan. Dr. Weiss agreed. Starting with the extraction he's arranging, we need an alternative, somewhere to analyze these documents fully before deciding who to trust. Richard considered their limited options. They were fugitives tracked by multiple government agencies. Their faces were likely being circulated to law enforcement nationwide, their movements constrained by roadblocks and surveillance. And now their only ally had been revealed as something other than human. I know a place, he said finally. An old truck stop outside Chattanooga. Closed years ago, but the owner, a retired driver I worked with, kept the property. Uses it as a storage facility now. No one would think to look for us there. Weiss considered the suggestion. How far? 2 hours, maybe less. Remote enough to be secure, close enough to major transport if we need to move quickly. She nodded decisively. Let's go, and we don't contact Mike until we know exactly what we're dealing with. As they left the coffee shop, Richard cast one final glance at the briefcase containing Weiss's father's records. Somewhere in those documents lay the truth about Project Deepwater, about the modified subjects, about the facility he had discovered, about Mike Donovan's true nature and purpose, and perhaps buried in half-century-old military terminology and scientific notation, they would find something else, a way to prevent the looming confrontation between the abandoned subjects of a forgotten experiment and the modern military forces deployed to erase them from existence. What had begun as a simple dive along the Gulf Coast had led him here, to the center of a dark chapter in American military history that refused to remain buried. The rusted rails he had followed beneath the waves had set him on a path from which there was no turning back. And somewhere out there, the modified subjects of Project Deepwater were fighting to reclaim their place in a world that had consigned them to an underwater tomb. Whatever they had become during 50 years of isolation beneath the waves, they were now demonstrating a terrible truth. Some secrets refused to stay submerged forever. The abandoned truck stop outside Chattanooga provided the perfect hideaway, remote enough to avoid detection, yet close enough to civilization for necessary supplies. The main building, its faded sign still advertising Hank's 24-hour truck haven, had long since been converted to storage, filled with stacked furniture and forgotten inventory. But the small manager's office in the back remained functional, with basic amenities and, crucially, no digital footprint. Richard and Dr. Weiss had been there for 3 days, poring over the documents recovered from the Birmingham safety deposit box. They had spread the papers across a makeshift workspace, shipping manifests, research notes, personnel records, and the disturbing medical documentation of Project Deepwater's advancements. These modification protocols go far beyond what should have been possible in the late 1960s, Dr. Weiss murmured, examining a detailed diagram of respiratory alterations. They were experimenting with techniques that weren't publicly known until decades later. Richard nodded grimly. The Cold War pushed boundaries we're still discovering. The question is, what do we do with this information now? The photograph of young Michael Donovan, test subject 17, lay at the center of their investigation, a haunting reminder of their uncertain alliance. They had not contacted Mike since discovering his true identity, uncertain whether he was ally, manipulator, or something else entirely. "We need to understand his motivation," Dr. Weiss insisted. "If he's one of them, one of the successfully modified subjects, then why help us uncover the project? Why not suppress the discovery?" Richard had been wrestling with the same question. Maybe there are factions among the subjects. Those who want revenge versus those who want, what, recognition? Justice? Or perhaps he's monitoring the situation for whoever supervised the original containment. Dr. Weiss sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. Without direct contact, we can only speculate. They had rigged a basic communication setup, a battery-powered radio that could receive emergency broadcasts and a prepaid laptop connected to a mobile hotspot for limited, cautious internet access. The situation along the Gulf Coast had escalated dramatically, though official channels remained vague about the nature of the threat. Coastal evacuations had expanded to 20 miles inland. Military exclusion zones were established around major ports. The president had authorized National Guard deployment across 5 states, all attributed to an organized terrorist action against critical infrastructure, with no mention of underwater facilities or modified naval personnel. Richard was scanning the latest news reports when the laptop chimed with an incoming message. They had created a secure email account, shared only with trusted contacts from Dr. Weiss's academic network, researchers she believed might provide insights without compromising their location. But this message came from an unknown sender. No subject line. Just 3 lines of text. "We know what you saw. We know what you have. Decision time approaches." Richard felt a cold sensation creep up his spine. Could be anyone, government, military, Mike. Or them, Dr. Weiss added quietly, the subjects. The message contained no threats, no demands, just the unsettling acknowledgement that their actions were being monitored. Someone, or something, was watching, waiting for them to make their next move. Before they could discuss further, the radio crackled with an emergency broadcast. A special news bulletin reported unprecedented coastal disturbances along the Florida-Alabama border, with multiple naval vessels responding to an environmental anomaly offshore. Civilian witnesses described unusual lights beneath the water and strange figures seen briefly on remote beaches before disappearing into the Gulf. "They're pushing inland," Richard realized. "Testing defenses, maybe. Or looking for something." "Or someone," Dr. Weiss suggested. "If Mike is one of them, perhaps they're looking for others like him, modified subjects who were allowed to live in society." The possibility hung between them, that Project Deepwater's legacy might extend far beyond the underwater container Richard had discovered. That modified humans might have been living among the general population for decades, their true nature concealed even from themselves. Richard's phone buzzed, not the burner phone they used for secure communications, but his personal device, which he had kept powered off since their escape from Pensacola. He stared at it with apprehension. "Don't answer it," Dr. Weiss warned. "They could track the signal." "They already know where we are," Richard replied, a certainty settling in his gut. "Or they wouldn't have sent that email to our secure account." He powered on the phone, multiple missed calls and messages, most from unknown numbers. But one text message caught his attention, sent hours ago from Mike's last known number. "Compromised, they're coming, destroy everything." As if on cue, the distant sound of helicopter rotors cut through the quiet night. Richard moved to the window, peering through a gap in the blinds. A searchlight swept across the overgrown truck stop parking lot. "We need to move, now." He began gathering the most crucial documents, stuffing them into Dr. Weiss's waterproof pack. She grabbed the laptop, disconnecting it from power. "There's a back exit through the storage area, leads to service road behind the property." They worked with practiced efficiency, prioritizing the most damning evidence. The personnel records proving the subjects' identities, the medical documentation of illegal modifications, the deployment orders authorizing the abandonment of test subjects deemed unsuitable for reintegration. The helicopter circled closer, its searchlight methodically sweeping the area. Through the thin walls came another sound. Vehicles approaching on the access road, engines cutting as they neared the building. Too late to run, Richard assessed grimly. They've surrounded the place. Dr. Weiss moved to a storage cabinet, retrieving the small firearm she had taken from her boat. We can't let them take these documents. This is the only proof of what happened to those men. Richard weighed their options. None good. Attempting to fight their way past what was likely a professional military or intelligence team would be suicide. Surrendering meant losing the evidence and possibly their lives, if whoever had come for them was determined to maintain Project Deepwater's secrecy. A voice crackled through a megaphone outside. This is a United States Navy Special Operations Unit. The building is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible. You have 60 seconds to comply. Richard and Dr. Weiss exchanged looks of resigned determination. Whatever happened next, their discovery had forced the government to acknowledge, at least privately, the existence of the underwater facility and its abandoned subjects. If we're taken, Dr. Weiss said quietly, we stick to the truth. Everything we've seen, everything we've learned, no matter what they say or do. Richard nodded, then noticed something, a small ventilation shaft near the floor, partially concealed by an old desk, just large enough for the documents, he whispered urgently. We can hide the core evidence. They'll search us, search the building, but they might miss this. Working quickly, they selected the most damning pages, the modification protocols, the command authorization for abandonment, the photographs of test subjects, and sealed them in a plastic bag. Richard pried open the ventilation cover and pushed the package deep into the shaft, far enough that a cursory inspection wouldn't reveal it. 30 seconds, the voice announced outside. They replaced the cover, pushed the desk back into position, and stood facing the door. Richard took Dr. Weiss's hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity before whatever came next. Remember, he said quietly, whatever happens, we found the truth. They can't undo that. The door burst open with military precision. Figures in tactical gear flooded the room, weapons trained on them, lights blinding after the dim interior. Richard raised his hand slowly, blinking against the harsh beams. Richard Hayes and Dr. Sarah Weiss, a voice confirmed from behind the lights. You're being detained under national security protocols. Cooperate fully and you will not be harmed. They were separated immediately, each escorted by 2 operators to different vehicles. As they led him out, Richard caught a glimpse of the operation's scale. Multiple helicopters, armored vehicles, at least 20 personnel in unmarked tactical uniforms. Not local law enforcement, not even standard military. Something more specialized. They covered his head with a black hood before pushing him into the vehicle. The drive that followed seemed deliberately circuitous, changing directions frequently, varying speeds, designed to disorient. Richard tracked time in his head, estimating they traveled for at least 2 hours before stopping. When they removed the hood, he found himself in a sterile interrogation room. Windowless, with a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, and a large mirror that undoubtedly concealed an observation area. Classic in its simplicity and intimidation. They left him alone for what felt like hours, a standard tactic to increase anxiety and compliance. Richard used the time to center himself, to organize his thoughts, to prepare for the questioning that would inevitably come. When the door finally opened, the man who entered wasn't what Richard expected. No uniform, no tactical gear, just an impeccably tailored suit and the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Gray-haired, probably in his 60s, with the weathered face of a career military man who had transitioned to intelligence or administration. Mr. Hayes, he sat across from Richard, placing a thin folder on the table. I'm Director Alan Campbell, Office of Naval Intelligence. I'd like to discuss your recent activities in the Gulf of Mexico. Richard remained silent, assessing. The fact they had sent someone of apparent significant rank suggested the seriousness with which they viewed the situation. Where is Dr. Weiss? He finally asked. Being interviewed separately. Campbell's expression revealed nothing. Her cooperation will influence her situation considerably. We haven't done anything illegal, Richard stated flatly. I went diving in public waters. I found something. I took photos. Since when is that a national security offense? Campbell opened the folder, removing several printouts of Richard's underwater photographs. These images show a classified naval installation that officially does not exist. Your subsequent actions, fleeing federal authorities, contacting known surveillance targets, accessing restricted documents, constitute multiple violations of national security protocols. That installation contained abandoned naval personnel, Richard countered. American servicemen who volunteered for a project were illegally modified and then left to die when the results became inconvenient. That's what doesn't officially exist. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps respect, crossed Campbell's face before his professional mask returned. You've been misinformed about what you discovered. Have I? Richard leaned forward. Test subjects 12 through 47. Biological modifications to create underwater operatives. Project Deepwater, later renamed Operation Charybdis after the initial failures. Officially terminated in 1972, but actually just buried, literally, along with the evidence. Campbell studied him silently for a long moment. Where is Michael Donovan? The question caught Richard off guard. I don't know. When did you last have contact with him? Days ago, before we discovered he was test subject 17. That produced a visible reaction. Campbell's eyes narrowing slightly. What exactly do you think you know about Michael Donovan? Richard decided to play his strongest card. I know he was one of the volunteers who underwent the complete modification protocol. I know his father was security chief for the project. I know he's been living among regular humans for decades while something about him is fundamentally not human anymore. Campbell closed the folder deliberately. Mr. Hayes, the situation you've stumbled into is considerably more complex than you realize. What you discovered in the Gulf has implications beyond national security, implications for how we understand human potential itself. Is that how you justify abandoning American servicemen? Calling it human potential? No one was abandoned, Campbell stated firmly. That's where your information is incomplete. A knock at the door interrupted them. Campbell stepped outside briefly, conversing in low tones with someone in the hallway. When he returned, his demeanor had shifted subtly. Circumstances have changed, he announced. We're relocating you. Before Richard could respond, two guards entered, securing his hands with plastic restraints. They escorted him through a series of corridors that confirmed his suspicions. They were in a military facility, likely underground based on the absence of windows and the faint but persistent hum of ventilation systems. They led him to a secure elevator, descending for what felt like several minutes. When the doors opened, the environment changed dramatically. Older construction, concrete walls rather than modern materials. Lighting that suggested backup systems rather than primary power. Cold War-era bunker, Richard assessed aloud. We're going deeper into whatever rabbit hole Project Deepwater created. Neither guard responded, marching him forward to a heavy steel door that required both keycard and biometric access. Beyond it lay a command center that seemed frozen in time, 1960s technology updated with modern interfaces, maintaining the aesthetic of its original construction while incorporating contemporary functionality. Screens displayed satellite imagery of the Gulf Coast, focusing on an area Richard recognized immediately, the waters where he had discovered the underwater rails. The images showed significant naval activity surrounding a precise location, with what appeared to be specialized equipment being deployed from research vessels. In the center of the room, reviewing these operations, stood Mike Donovan. Richard stopped short, staring at the man he had thought was his friend, the man who, according to the evidence, was something far different from human. Mike turned, his expression unreadable. Hayes, good. We need your direct testimony. Testimony about what? Richard demanded, anger rising through his confusion. About how you used me, how you knew exactly what I'd find down there because you're one of them. I'm not one of them, Mike replied calmly. I'm the son of one of them, the genetic heir to their legacy. Before Richard could process this statement, another figure emerged from a side room, Dr. Weiss, unrestrained and apparently unharmed, accompanied by an older man in naval uniform. Richard, she called, relief evident in her voice. They've shown me everything. This isn't what we thought. What are you talking about? Richard looked between her, Mike, and the various officials surrounding them. These people detained us at gunpoint, separated us, interrogated us. Because time is critical, the naval officer interjected. I'm Admiral James Harrington, Joint Special Operations Command. And right now, we're facing a crisis that began 50 years ago when a classified program made a catastrophic miscalculation. Mike approached Richard, signaling the guards to remove his restraints. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. My father wasn't just the security chief for Project Deepwater. He was the one who tried to shut it down when the modifications began producing unexpected results. Unexpected how? Richard rubbed his wrists, still wary but increasingly curious. The subjects began developing capabilities beyond the project parameters, Admiral Harrington explained. Cognitive alterations, not just physical ones. Shared consciousness, possibly even aspects of group intelligence. Dr. Weiss joined them, carrying a tablet displaying historical documents. Richard, these are the complete files, not just my father's records, but the official project documentation. What happened wasn't abandonment. It was containment of something they couldn't control or reverse. Richard looked at the tablet skeptically, then back at Mike. And where do you fit into this? The photograph we found clearly shows you as one of the test subjects. Not me, Mike corrected. My uncle, Michael Donovan Sr., my father's younger brother. They were nearly identical, a family trait that's continued through generations. He volunteered for the program despite my father's objections. Admiral Harrington gestured toward the central display. When the modified subjects began exhibiting unexpected traits, Commander Robert Donovan advocated for project termination. But several subjects, including his brother, had progressed beyond the point where the modifications could be reversed. So they built the underwater facility, Richard concluded, pieces falling into place, not as a research station, but as a containment system. A humane solution to an impossible situation, Mike confirmed. The subjects couldn't survive on land anymore, but they could thrive underwater with the proper support systems. The facility was designed to be self-sustaining with automated maintenance and resource generation. But something went wrong, Dr. Weiss interjected. The isolation affected their psychology. The modifications continued evolving beyond the original parameters, and eventually communication with the surface ceased entirely. Richard studied the satellite imagery more carefully now, noticing patterns in the naval deployment. These aren't attack formations. They're a containment perimeter. Correct, Admiral Harrington confirmed. When you and Donovan discovered the facility and inadvertently reactivated its systems, you triggered a contingency protocol that had been dormant for decades. The modified subjects aren't attacking coastal infrastructure. They're following pre-programmed pathways to secondary containment facilities. Contingency bunkers, Mike explained, indicating several locations on the map, designed as fallback positions if the primary facility was compromised. They're seeking secure environments where their unique physiological needs can be met. Richard processed this information, comparing it against what they had discovered in Dr. Weiss's father's records. If that's true, why the military response? Why the evacuation of coastal communities? Because we don't know how they've evolved during 50 years of isolation, Admiral Harrington stated bluntly. The original subjects were volunteers, naval personnel committed to serving their country, but their cognitive architecture has been altering progressively for half a century without any human contact or cultural context. They're still human, Dr. Weiss insisted. Modified, yes, but fundamentally human beings who deserve dignity and care. Which is why we're attempting a cooperative approach rather than simply eliminating the potential threat, Campbell added, entering the command center. But that requires understanding what they want, how they communicate, what they've become. And that, Mike concluded, turning to Richard, is where you come in. You're the only civilian who's seen them, who made direct contact without preconceptions or military objectives. We need your perspective. Richard looked around the room, at the officials, the monitors, the historical weight of a 50-year-old secret now unraveling in real time. You want me to help you communicate with them? After your people held guns to my head and dragged me here in restraints? We want you to help us prevent unnecessary casualties, Admiral Harrington clarified. On both sides. Molna technician approached with urgent news. One of the modified subjects had been captured alive after becoming separated from the main group. It was being transported to a secure medical facility for examination and possible communication attempt. I want to see it, Richard demanded immediately. If you want my help, I need to see for myself what these men have become. The transport took less than an hour, the medical facility apparently adjacent to the command bunker. Richard, accompanied by Dr. Weiss, Mike, and Admiral Harrington, passed through multiple security checkpoints before reaching the observation area. Beyond a reinforced glass barrier lay a specialized containment chamber, part medical suite, part aquatic environment. Inside, monitored by sensors and cameras, was a being that challenged Richard's understanding of human potential. The subject retained a humanoid form, but with profound alterations. The skin had transformed to a texture resembling flexible scales, with a blue-gray coloration that would provide perfect camouflage in deep water. The neck featured external gill structures alongside what appeared to be a modified respiratory system that could process both air and water. The limbs had elongated, fingers webbed, with visible musculature optimized for underwater propulsion. But it was the eyes that captured Richard's attention. Large, adapted for low-light conditions, yet unmistakably human in their expression. They conveyed intelligence, awareness, and something Richard hadn't expected. Recognition. "It knows me," he whispered. "From the duck, it saw me before we fled." Dr. Weiss stepped closer to the glass. "The modifications are more extensive than my father's notes suggested. They've continued evolving." "Adaptive physiology was part of the original design," Admiral Harrington explained. "The ability to optimize for changing underwater conditions. But the degree of transformation exceeds anything the project scientists anticipated." Medical personnel moved cautiously around the chamber, adjusting environmental controls, monitoring vital signs displayed on surrounding screens. The subject watched them with evident intelligence, making no aggressive movements despite its obvious strength. "Has it communicated?" Richard asked. "Not verbally," Mike replied. "The vocal apparatus has been significantly modified, but it's been responding to visual cues, demonstrating comprehension of basic instructions." Richard studied the being carefully, noticing subtle details, scarring that suggested surgical interventions, markings on what remained of its uniform that might indicate rank or specialty, and something else, a small object clutched in one webbed hand. "What's it holding?" he asked, pointing. The medical team adjusted a camera, zooming in on the object. It appeared to be a metal disc, corroded by decades underwater but still recognizable as a military identification tag. Dog tags. Identity, Dr. Weiss realized. It's holding on to its human identity. Admiral Harrington conferred with the medical team, who magnified the image further, attempting to read the engraved information. After several adjustments, a name became visible. Donovan, MJ, Lieutenant, USN. Mike stepped back involuntarily. "My uncle, test subject 17. Richard turned to him, understanding dawning. "That's why you've been monitoring this situation all these years. Not just professional obligation, family connection. My father dedicated his life to ensuring the subjects received proper care even after the project was officially terminated," Mike confirmed quietly. "When he died, I continued his work through naval intelligence, watching for signs that the containment system might fail." Dr. Weiss approached Admiral Harrington. "These aren't mindless creatures or simple weapons. They're veterans who volunteered for an experimental program and paid an unimaginable price. They deserve recognition, not containment or elimination." "The question isn't what they deserve," Campbell interjected, joining them in the observation area. "It's what they need now after 50 years of isolation and continued physiological change, and what they might be capable of if they feel threatened or abandoned again." As if in response to the conversation, the modified Donovan rose from the examination platform where it had been resting. Moving with fluid grace despite the unfamiliar environment, it approached the glass barrier separating it from the observers. With deliberate precision, it pressed its identification tags against the glass, directly in front of Richard. Then, using its webbed finger, it traced a pattern in the condensation that had formed on its side of the barrier. "Remember us," the simple message sent a chill through the observation room. Not just communication, coherent, intentional communication driven by a clearly human concept, the desire to be remembered, to have one's sacrifice acknowledged. That's what they want, Richard realized aloud. Not revenge, not escape, recognition, acknowledgement of what was done to them. Dr. Weiss nodded slowly. They were erased from history, Their families told they died in training accidents, their existence classified beyond reach. For 50 years, they've been the living dead, neither properly mourned nor officially alive. Admiral Harrington studied the message with grave attention. If that's true, perhaps there's a path forward that doesn't involve military confrontation. The modified Donovan traced another message beneath the first. Others coming. Richard exchanged alarmed glances with Dr. Weiss. The other subjects are still moving toward the contingency facilities. If they reach populated areas in their current state, mass panic, Campbell concluded grimly, regardless of their intentions. We need to communicate with them directly, Richard decided, not through intermediaries, not through military channels. They need to know they've been found, that their story will be told. How? Mike asked practically. They're scattered across 50 miles of coastline, moving underwater where we can barely track them. Richard turned back to the modified Donovan, who watched the exchange with evident understanding. He can take us to them, or at least guide our approach. Absolutely not, Campbell objected immediately. The security risks are less significant than the risks of failed containment or direct conflict, Admiral Harrington interrupted. If Hayes can establish communication, prevent these hornets from emerging in populated areas. I'll go with him, Dr. Weiss volunteered. My father's research gives me insight into their physiological needs, their potential limitations. Mike stepped forward. I'm going too. My uncle, he gestured toward the modified Donovan, might respond more positively to family, even after all this time. The debate continued for hours, strategy sessions and risk assessments flowing into one another as the naval perimeter reported increased activity among the remaining modified subjects. They were converging on a single location, a natural depression in the seabed 20 miles offshore, near the original facility Richard had discovered. They're regrouping, Admiral Harrington assessed, studying the underwater surveillance footage, perhaps responding to the capture of one of their own. Richard, reviewing the historical documents now made available to him, recognized the location. That's not random. It's a secondary access point to the underground research facility, an emergency exit designed for precisely this scenario. The plan came together with reluctant consensus from all parties. Richard, Dr. Weiss, and Mike would approach the gathering point in a specialized submersible, accompanied by minimal military presence to maintain security. The captured subject, the modified Donovan, would be returned to its companions as a gesture of good faith, with communications equipment that would allow ongoing dialogue. In exchange for peaceful resolution, the government would acknowledge the existence of Project Deepwater, provide appropriate care for the surviving subjects, and allow a controlled release of information vindicating the volunteers who had been erased from history. This goes against every protocol for classified operations, Campbell objected even as preparations began. 50 years of secrecy undone because a truck driver went diving in the wrong place. The wrong place, Richard corrected, or exactly the right place. Some secrets shouldn't stay buried, especially when they involve American servicemen who were treated as expendable experiments. As dawn broke over the Gulf Coast, a specialized vessel departed from a naval research facility, carrying a small team toward what would either be a historic reconciliation or a confrontation with consequences beyond imagination. Richard Hayes, who had only wanted the freedom of the open water, now found himself at the center of a classified chapter of American military history finally reaching its conclusion. The modified Donovan, secured in a specialized transport chamber, but treated with evident respect, watched the proceedings with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. When Richard approached before departure, it pressed its webbed hand against the container wall, tracing a final message. Truth surfaces. Whether warning or promise, Richard couldn't tell. But as the vessel cut through the morning waves toward the gathering place of beings who were neither fully human nor truly something else, he knew that whatever happened next would forever change how humanity understood its potential and its responsibilities toward those who sacrificed everything in service to their country. The specialized submersible descended through layers of increasingly dark water, its external lights cutting bright cones through the marine twilight. Richard sat in the observation compartment alongside Dr. Weiss, Mike, and a naval communications specialist, watching depth readings tick steadily upward. 100 feet, the pilot announced from the forward compartment, proceeding to target coordinates. Through the reinforced viewport, Richard could see nothing but open water and the occasional flash of marine life startled by their passage. But the vessel's advanced sonar painted a different picture on the monitoring screens. A topographical map of the seabed showing the depression where the modified subjects had gathered. Multiple biological signatures detected, the sonar operator reported, consistent with target profiles. 17 distinct entities holding position at the secondary access point. 17, Dr. Weiss repeated quietly, out of 47 original subjects. The others may have died during the containment period, Mike suggested, his expression grim, or evolved beyond our ability to recognize or track them. The transport chamber containing the modified Donovan had been secured in a specialized compartment, designed to open directly to the outside environment when they reached their destination. The being remained calm throughout the descent, watching the proceedings with evident intelligence, but making no attempt to communicate further. Approaching the perimeter now, the pilot announced. 500 yards from primary gathering site. Admiral Harrington's voice came through the communication system from the surface vessel above. Remember the protocol, release the recovered subject first as a gesture of good faith. Establish communication if possible. Retreat immediately if you detect any aggressive movement or unauthorized approach to the submersible. Understood, Richard confirmed, though his focus remained on the viewport rather than the communication panel. The submersible's lights illuminated their first view of the gathering site. The depression in the seabed was larger than it had appeared on sonar, roughly circular and clearly artificial in its construction. At its center, a structure resembling a massive airlock protruded from the sand, its surface encrusted with marine growth, but its purpose unmistakable. And surrounding it, arranged in a precise formation that suggested military discipline maintained through decades of isolation, were the modified subjects. The sight stole Richard's breath. Each being was similar to the captured Donovan in its fundamental modifications: gills, scaled skin, webbed extremities, but with variations that spoke to individual adaptation and specialization. Some appeared optimized for speed, with streamlined physiques and elongated limbs. Others displayed more robust builds, suggesting strength or endurance priorities. All maintained a recognizable humanoid form, yet all had clearly evolved far beyond baseline human parameters. My God, Dr. Weiss whispered. They've developed distinct adaptations, specialized roles within their group. Like a military unit, Mike observed, maintaining operational structure even after all this time. The pilot maneuvered the submersible to a respectful distance from the formation, holding position approximately 50 yards from the gathered subjects. Through the viewport, Richard could see them observing the vessel with evident awareness, making no aggressive movements, but clearly assessing the situation with tactical precision. Initiating subject release, the technical officer announced, activating the sequence that would open the external compartment containing the modified Donovan. Richard watched as the chamber opened, water flooding in to equalize pressure before the outer door retracted. The modified Donovan hesitated only briefly before propelling itself out of confinement with a powerful thrust of its webbed limbs. It swam toward its companions with fluid grace, movement so natural in the underwater environment that Richard was reminded again of how fundamentally these men had been changed. Not simply modified humans, but beings evolved for a different world entirely, a world of pressure and currents instead of gravity and air. The reunification was brief but clearly emotional, even across the species barrier. The modified subjects converged around their returned companion, physical contact conveying what verbal communication could not. Then, with military precision, they reformed their original pattern, with one significant difference. They had created an opening in their formation, a clear invitation for approach. They want direct contact, Richard assessed. They're giving us an opportunity to communicate. It's too risky, the security officer objected immediately. Protocol hasn't accounted for this situation in 50 years. Richard cut him off. We're beyond standard procedures now. Dr. Weiss studied the formation carefully. They're demonstrating cooperative intent. If we reject this overture, we may not get another, Mike finished her thought. The question is, How do we communicate effectively? We don't have their adaptations for underwater function. Richard had been considering this problem since their departure. The submersible has an external communication system, lights, mechanical signaling devices. Basic, but functional. And we have these, Dr. Weiss added, producing waterproof tablets they had brought for this purpose, loaded with simple communication software. If they retain language comprehension, written communication should be possible. After brief consultation with Admiral Harrington on the surface, a compromise was reached. The submersible would maintain its position, but extend a mechanical arm equipped with one of the communication tablets. The modified subjects could approach this device without direct contact with the vessel itself, maintaining security while enabling dialogue. The technical officer deployed the mechanical arm, extending it toward the opening in the formation with the tablet secured at its end. For several tense moments, none of the modified subjects moved. Then, with deliberate purpose, one figure detached from the formation and approached the device. Not the recently returned Donovan, but another subject, larger with more pronounced adaptations suggesting greater time spent at extreme depths. It examined the tablet with evident curiosity before touching the screen with a webbed finger. The communication software activated, displaying a simple interface with basic language options. To everyone's astonishment, the subject navigated the system with apparent familiarity, selecting the text input function and beginning to type with surprising dexterity despite its modified hands. "We have waited, you have come." The message appeared on the duplicate tablet inside the submersible, clear and precise. Not the communication of mindless experiments or feral creatures, but intelligent beings with intact language capacity. Richard responded immediately. "We found your facility. We want to understand what happened to you." The subject considered this for a moment before typing. "We were forgotten, left to adapt. We became more than intended." Dr. Weiss leaned forward, adding her own message. "Do you need help, medical care, recognition?" The response came more quickly this time. "We need acknowledgement, our sacrifice recorded, our existence honored." Mike, who had been watching silently, finally added his own question. "What do you plan now? What are your intentions toward the surface?" The subject seemed to consider this question more carefully, conferring briefly with the others in the formation, using movements that suggested some form of nonverbal communication. When it returned to the tablet, its message was longer. "We seek no conflict, no revenge, only recognition of our service and sacrifice. The world has changed, we have changed, but we remain Americans who served our country. We ask only for the truth to be known." Richard felt a profound wave of relief wash over him. Not harbingers of destruction or mindless weapons awakened from cold storage, but veterans, profoundly changed, yes, but still driven by recognizably human values: honor, recognition, acknowledgement of sacrifice. The dialogue continued for nearly an hour, establishing basic parameters for ongoing communication and eventual reintegration, not into conventional society, which would be impossible given their physiological adaptations, but into an acknowledged place in history and appropriate support systems for their unique needs. As they prepared to return to the surface, the lead subject sent a final message. "Lieutenant Michael Donovan served with honor. Tell his family he completed his mission." Mike stared at the words for a long moment before responding. "I am his nephew, his brother's son. I will ensure your story is told." The subject studied this response, then glanced toward the submersible viewport with an expression Richard could only interpret as profound recognition, not just of Mike's words, but of the connection across generations, the family resemblance that had survived despite the gulf between their worlds. As the submersible began its ascent toward the surface, Richard gazed back at the formation of modified subjects, American servicemen who had volunteered for an experimental program, been transformed beyond recognition, abandoned for decades, yet maintained their fundamental humanity through 50 years of isolation and physiological change. What emerged in the weeks that followed was unprecedented in American military history, a controlled declassification of Project Deepwater, presented as a historical recognition of Cold War-era research and the volunteers who participated in it. The full truth was moderated for public consumption, emphasizing the subject's voluntary service while downplaying the more extreme aspects of their modifications and the ethical failures of their abandonment. Richard, Dr. Weiss, and Mike served as civilian liaisons during the process, ensuring the subjects' perspectives were represented in decisions about their future. A permanent underwater installation was established at the original facility site, modernized to provide appropriate medical monitoring and communication systems while respecting the modified subject's need for a suitable environment. For his part, Richard Hayes found his life transformed beyond recognition. The truck driver, who had sought only the freedom of underwater exploration, became a reluctant historical figure. The civilian who had discovered one of America's most classified Cold War secrets and forced a reckoning with its legacy. 6 months after the initial contact, Richard stood on the deck of a research vessel anchored above the underwater facility. Beside him, Dr. Weiss reviewed data from the ongoing monitoring program, while Mike prepared for another communication session with his transformed uncle. They're adapting the secondary chambers for improved communication interfaces, Dr. Weiss reported. The subjects have been remarkably cooperative with the technical teams. They understand the value of collaboration now, Richard observed. 50 years of isolation taught them not to waste an opportunity for connection. A naval officer approached, offering Richard a small metal container. This came from Lieutenant Donovan. He specifically requested it be delivered to you. Inside the container, preserved despite decades underwater, was a conductor's hat keychain, identical to the one Richard had glimpsed during his initial exploration of the underwater facility. Attached was a waterproof note, written in the modified Donovan's distinctive script, "To remember the man who found us when others forgot." Richard closed his hand around the simple token, a connection between worlds, between past and present, between what humanity had been and what it might become. The rails he had followed beneath the waves had led him to more than just an abandoned facility. They had led to a profound truth about human resilience and the enduring need for recognition. As the sun set over the Gulf of Mexico, casting golden light across waters that now held fewer secrets, Richard contemplated the journey that had brought him here. From truck driver to diver to reluctant hero, he had traveled a path as unexpected as the underwater rails themselves. Some secrets, he had learned, refuse to remain buried. Some truths demand to surface, no matter how deep they've been hidden. And sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come from simply following an unexpected path to see where it leads. The modified subjects of Project Deepwater had waited 50 years for acknowledgement. Thanks to one man's curiosity and courage, they had finally received it, not as failed experiments or abandoned weapons, but as American servicemen who had made extraordinary sacrifices in service to their country. Their story, once classified beyond reach, had finally emerged from the depths. And in bringing that truth to light, Richard Hayes had discovered something about himself as well, that even an ordinary man can accomplish extraordinary things when driven by the simple human desire to uncover the truth, no matter how deep it lies.